It was early September of 2013 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 24 back then, living in Boise, Idaho, and working long, dull hours at a warehouse. I had been feeling drained, like my brain had gone on autopilot for months. So when I finally got a week off, I packed up my old blue Tacoma and headed north toward Payette National Forest. I didn't really tell anyone where I was going, only that I'd be gone for a few days. I figured I needed some peace, maybe a quiet few nights in the woods to reset my head. The drive took about 4 hours, with the last stretch being a winding dirt road that barely fit my truck. It was the kind of road where you don't see another car for hours. I found a small clearing near a slow-moving stream, surrounded by thick pine and fir trees that looked untouched for decades. The place had a calm, empty feeling to it, almost too empty, but I liked that. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the steady sound of the water. I set up my tent beside a big fallen log and started a small fire. The air was crisp but not cold. It smelled like pine sap and wet earth. I ate a quick meal from a can, and by the time I finished, the light was fading. I sat there a while, watching the fire crackle, feeling the warmth against my legs, and listening to how quiet everything got once the sun was gone. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small noise. Twigs snapping, leaves moving, distant rustles that you tell yourself are animals. That first night, I barely slept. I kept waking up at every sound. Once, I heard something splash in the stream, close enough that I could hear the water drip afterward. Another time, I swore I heard footsteps near my tent, slow and heavy, like someone stepping carefully. But after waiting and listening, it would fade, and I'd tell myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer. The woods play tricks on you when you're alone like that. The next morning, I felt stupid for being so jumpy. I made coffee on my little camping stove and went for a walk upstream. The forest looked beautiful in the morning light, mist still hanging low between the trees, water shining like glass. I walked for an hour before finding a spot where the stream widened into a shallow pool. There were boot prints in the mud along the edge, old ones maybe, but clear. I hadn't seen a single person since leaving the highway, so it made me wonder who had been out here before. I crouched down to look at them, some small, some larger. A few looked fresh. The mud was still soft around the edges. I went back to camp uneasy but brushed it off. There could have been hunters or hikers around, even if I hadn't seen them. Still, I started to notice little things that day that didn't sit right. A couple of branches near my tent looked freshly broken, and I couldn't remember if they'd been like that when I arrived. Then I found a half-buried piece of cloth near the log I used to sit on. It was torn and stained, maybe an old rag or part of a shirt, but it looked recent, not weathered or old. That night, the noises started again. Around midnight, I woke up to something crunching through the underbrush, steady and slow, not scurrying like an animal. It stopped and started again, circling my camp. I lay still, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, barely breathing. The sound stopped for maybe 10 minutes, and then I heard a soft splash in the stream. It was so close that I could feel my chest tightening. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just waited. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. When I finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent a little, everything outside looked still. The moonlight lit up the clearing. The stream shimmered faintly. I couldn't see anything moving, no shadows, no shape. But when I stepped out the next morning, I found footprints in the damp dirt. They were larger than mine, pressed deep, leading from the trees toward the stream. I followed them for a bit until they disappeared into the mud. That's when I decided I'd pack up after one more night. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down I just wanted daylight. The third day was quiet, almost too quiet. Even the birds seemed to stay away. I barely left camp, just kept the fire going and tried to relax. By evening, a thick fog rolled in, the kind that makes everything look closer than it is. I sat near the fire, staring into it, trying not to think too much. I heard a faint metallic sound then, like something brushing against my truck. I turned, and through the fog I could barely make out the shape of it. I walked over slowly, shining my flashlight on the side. The driver's door was slightly open. I knew I had shut it, The inside of the truck smelled like wet dirt. My backpack, which I'd left in the passenger seat, was on the ground outside, half unzipped. My extra flashlight was missing. I stood there in the fog for a long time, trying to listen for movement, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I decided not to wait until morning. I tossed everything into the truck as fast as I could, barely caring about packing right. The fog was thick enough that my headlights only showed a few feet ahead, but I started driving down that dirt road anyway. After about 10 minutes, I saw something in the headlights. A figure standing on the side of the road, just beyond the bend. I hit the brakes hard. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes, holding something long, maybe a stick or a crowbar. He didn't move as I slowed down. I didn't even stop fully. I just pressed harder on the gas and swerved around him. My tires threw up dirt, and in the mirror, I saw him step toward the center of the road, still watching. It took me hours to reach the highway. When I finally did, I pulled over at a gas station and sat there, shaking. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I checked everything, my phone, my bag, the back of the truck, just to make sure I was really alone. I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I just drove home and slept on the couch with the lights on. A few weeks later, while scrolling through local news online, I saw a small article about a missing camper up near Payette. It mentioned a man in his 40s who'd gone camping alone and hadn't been found. They showed a photo of the area. It looked exactly like where I'd been. They'd found his tent, but his truck was gone. That was when I realized that maybe those old boot prints weren't old at all. Maybe I hadn't been alone there from the start. I still think about that night sometimes, the fog, the sound by the stream, and the way he stood on the road. Like he knew I'd be coming that way eventually. I haven't been camping since. I went camping alone in the summer of 2016, up in the northern part of Montana, not far from the Canadian border. I had been doing solo camping trips for a few years by then, always trying to find quiet, remote places away from crowds. That time, I had picked a spot deep inside the Kootenay National Forest, several miles from the nearest paved road. The weather was dry, the air smelled like pine, and the days stretched long into the evening. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and peace when I parked my old silver Tacoma on the side of a dirt road and started hiking into the woods with my pack. I carried enough supplies for 3 nights, tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, water filter, and a small hatchet. The forest there was thick and uneven, filled with old trees that twisted and leaned like they'd been through storms. The ground was covered with dry needles, soft moss, and those small patches of sunlight that move slowly as the day goes by. I set up camp beside a small creek that flowed just loud enough to cover distant sounds. It looked perfect. I made a small fire, cooked some food, and sat watching the water turn golden from the sunset. It felt good, that type of silence that only deep woods can give. The first night went by without a problem. I woke up once or twice to the sound of something moving in the brush nearby, but that's normal in places like that. Deer or raccoons, nothing to worry about. The next morning, I decided to follow the creek upstream. I hiked for about an hour, crossing over fallen logs and slippery stones, until I came to a wide clearing with old tree stumps. It looked like an old logging area long forgotten. There was even a half-buried piece of rusted metal that looked like part of an old machine. I walked around for a while, took a few pictures, and then decided to head back. When I returned, I noticed something small but strange. One of my backpack straps had been unbuckled. It wasn't torn or cut, just unclipped. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I hadn't fastened it properly, or maybe the wind moved it. Still, it stuck in my mind longer than I wanted it to. That evening, the forest grew colder earlier than before. The shadows looked longer, and the wind carried this faint, whistling sound through the branches. I collected more firewood than usual and kept the fire burning strong. I sat there eating from a tin can of beans, trying not to let my mind wander. But as night settled, I noticed something else. There were fewer sounds. Normally you hear crickets, frogs, or distant rustles. That night, it was quiet. Too quiet. I could hear the creek, but everything else seemed to stop. I tried to sleep but kept waking up. Around 1 a.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps on dry leaves, slow and cautious. My tent fabric moved slightly from a faint gust, or maybe from pressure nearby. I froze. The steps didn't sound like an animal. They were spaced evenly with weight. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, but the light only caught the inside of the tent and a bit of the foggy air outside through the mesh. Nothing moved. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps stopped. For the next 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to lay back down, I heard something metallic fall. Maybe my pan or one of the tent stakes. I grabbed my knife, unzipped the tent slowly, and looked out. The fire had burned low, just a few glowing embers left. My cooking pan was on the ground near the fire pit, about 2 feet from where I'd left it. I picked it up, looked around the camp's edge, and saw faint tracks in the dirt leading toward the creek. They were human footprints, barefoot. The ground was soft, and the impressions were clear enough to tell that. I followed them for a few feet until they disappeared on the rocks near the water. I stood there for a while, looking into the dark trees across the creek, and felt the hairs on my neck lift. I went back to camp, put out what was left of the fire, and sat inside the tent with the knife in my hand. I barely slept. The next morning, I decided I was done. I packed up as fast as I could. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone else was camping nearby and had wandered close by accident, but I couldn't shake how quiet it had been, how deliberate those steps had sounded. I started the hike back toward where I'd parked my truck, following the same path along the creek, then up through the trees to the dirt road. But about half an hour into the hike, I noticed something new, another campsite. I swear it hadn't been there before. It was maybe 200 feet off the path, behind some brush. I only saw it because of the glint of sunlight off metal. It looked like an old, abandoned setup, torn tarp, rusted cookware, and an old sleeping bag half buried in dirt. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer. There were bones near the fire pit. Not human, at least I hoped not, but small ones, maybe from a deer or rabbit. They were clean, white, and piled neatly in a small circle. There was also a backpack there, faded blue, completely torn apart. Inside, I found old wrappers, a few empty cans, and a cracked phone that looked like it had been there for years. It sent a chill through me. I didn't stay long. When I finally reached my truck, it was late afternoon. The vehicle was fine except for one thing. The back tailgate was down. I hadn't left it that way. I stood there for a full minute, staring at it, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. My cooler had been moved slightly, and one of the water bottles was missing. I didn't even bother looking around. I just threw my stuff in and started the engine. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors. Every few minutes I thought I saw movement along the treeline. A flash of color, or maybe a shadow, always vanishing before I could focus. The road twisted through dense trees for miles, and I didn't relax until I hit the highway and saw the open land again. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I even checked the weather reports and forest updates later, and there hadn't been any hikers or campers reported missing in that area, at least not recently. But a week later, I read a small article online about a hunter who had gone missing somewhere not far from there. They found his camp torn apart, his rifle still leaning against a log. I never went camping alone again after that. I still go out sometimes, but only with a group and only to places with other people nearby. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I can still hear those careful, deliberate footsteps in my head. The sound of someone moving slowly through the dark, just outside the thin fabric of my tent, watching. It was early September, still warm enough during the day to camp without freezing at night, but cool enough that the bugs had started to die off. I had driven up to a place called Ash Valley, a quiet area in northern Montana where there were no designated campgrounds. Just open land, dirt roads, and endless forest. I had taken a week off from work, planning to hike, fish, and sleep under the stars. I wanted to be away from everything for a while. I was 27 then, tired of noise and people and my phone constantly lighting up with things I didn't want to think about. I parked my truck near a narrow dirt path that led down to a small creek. The trees there were thick, tall pines and cottonwoods leaning over the water. I could hear the faint sound of rushing from somewhere farther down the creek, maybe a waterfall or some rocks breaking the flow. I carried my gear down by hand, 2 trips in total, setting up camp beside a flat clearing where the grass had grown short and soft. The air smelled clean, like pine sap and cold dirt. I pitched my tent close enough to the water that I could hear it running when I lay down, but far enough that I wouldn't get damp air drifting in. The first day went exactly how I hoped. I walked about 5 miles along the creek, took a few photos of elk tracks, cooked canned beans and rice over my little stove, and sat by the fire until late. It got darker than I expected out there. No streetlights, no distant houses, not even airplane trails above. When I turned my lantern off that first night, it felt like I'd fallen into a cave. The woods were so quiet that every small sound, the snap of a twig, a soft rustle in the brush, made my skin tense. I remember lying there with my sleeping bag pulled up to my chest, staring at the roof of the tent, thinking about how fragile that thin layer of fabric really was. The second day, I hiked farther up into the hills behind my camp. I found a few old deer blinds, wooden platforms nailed into trees, clearly used years ago by hunters. They were weathered, half-collapsed, with nails sticking out and rope dangling. I noticed a few beer cans crushed near one of them, and even a small pile of what looked like old clothing shoved into the hollow of a log. It looked too deliberate to be trash, but I didn't think much of it. Probably just something a hunter left behind. When I got back to camp that evening, something felt slightly off. My backpack, which I'd left near the tent, wasn't where I'd dropped it. I figured maybe I just moved it earlier and forgot. But when I found it near the fire pit, the top flap was unbuckled. Nothing seemed stolen, my food, knife, flashlight all still there, but it felt wrong. I told myself an animal might have nosed through it, maybe a raccoon or a fox. I tightened the straps, ate dinner, and pushed the thought out of my head. That night I couldn't sleep well. The forest made new noises after midnight. It wasn't just the random cracking of branches. It was slower, deliberate sounds, like soft steps in dry grass, far off at first, then closer, stopping for long stretches before starting again. Every time I lifted my head, the sound stopped completely. I told myself it was deer. I repeated that to myself until I finally drifted off sometime near dawn. The next morning, I woke up to find small patches of trampled grass near the edge of my camp, right behind my tent. I could see clear depressions, not from hooves, but from boots. Human prints. I knelt down, touched the edges, and felt that weird hollow in my stomach that you get when something's not adding up. I hadn't seen anyone out there since I'd arrived. My truck was the only one parked along the dirt road. It was supposed to be miles before another campsite. I checked around, thinking maybe someone had walked by at night, lost or hunting. But there were no fresh tracks leading in or out of my clearing. Just those few prints circling behind where I'd been sleeping. I packed up a few essentials and hiked down the creek to see if I could find where they came from. The tracks disappeared about 30 feet from camp, swallowed by thick grass. I turned back, uneasy. That day I didn't do much. I stayed near camp, kept the fire going longer than usual, and found myself checking my surroundings constantly. Every time the wind moved through the trees, I felt my heart pick up a little. By the time the sun started setting, I decided to move my tent closer to the truck in the morning and head out the next day. The peaceful mood I came for was gone. I didn't like the idea of someone being out there, watching, maybe waiting for me to fall asleep again. That night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint metallic sound, like something light scraping across the fire grate. I stayed completely still, eyes open, listening. The sound came again, short, uneven, like a tool brushing against metal. Then I heard soft crunching footsteps in the grass, circling slowly around my tent. I could hear breathing too, slow and heavy. My throat felt locked. I didn't move. The steps stopped near the back of the tent for almost a full minute. Then the breathing faded away into the trees. I lay there till sunrise without sleeping another second. When it finally got light, I unzipped the tent carefully and stepped out. My fire pit had been disturbed. Ashes pushed aside, some small sticks arranged on top in a neat stack, like someone had tried to start it again but didn't have time. My water jug had been moved several feet away. I noticed something else too. Small torn pieces of white fabric caught on a nearby branch. It looked like from a shirt or maybe the lining of a jacket. I packed everything as fast as I could, threw it in the truck, and started driving back toward the main road. About a mile up, I saw tire marks in the dirt that hadn't been there when I arrived. Fresh ones with a distinct pattern from off-road tires. They stopped near an old trailhead, where someone had parked and then backed out. I didn't stop until I reached the small gas station 20 miles south. I stood there filling up, trying to convince myself I hadn't overreacted. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost and came across my camp, or someone who just wanted a place to rest. But it didn't feel like that. The deliberate way they moved, the silence, the breathing, none of it felt like someone just passing through. A week later, back home, I looked up reports of anything strange happening near Ash Valley. There were a few mentions of missing hunters, mostly from older articles, nothing recent. But one post on a small forum caught my eye. A guy had written about camping near that same creek the previous summer. He said he'd woken up one night to the sound of footsteps and found his tent cut open the next morning. He packed up and left too. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about those quiet footsteps in the grass, and how close they got without me ever hearing them come in. The woods used to make me feel calm. Now they just make me think of how easy it would be for someone to stand just beyond the light of your fire, watching you breathe, waiting for you to close your eyes. It was early September of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 26, living in Portland back then, working long shifts at a warehouse, and everything in my life felt like it was repeating itself. Same routes, same faces, same hours. I wanted a few days away from all of it, somewhere quiet. I picked a spot in the Deschutes National Forest in Oregon, a few miles away from any official campground. I didn't want to hear generators, car doors, or people laughing around fires. I just wanted silence. I had borrowed my cousin's old 4Runner, packed a tent, sleeping bag, a cooler, a small camping stove, and enough food and water for 3 days. I left early in the morning so I'd have plenty of daylight to set up. The drive took around 4 hours. The last stretch of road turned into a single narrow dirt trail that twisted through the trees. Pines thickened around me as the air turned cooler, sharper. The forest felt endless. The sound of gravel under the tires was the only thing breaking the stillness. I finally found a clearing just big enough for the tent and the truck. It was surrounded by tall pines on every side, and the ground was packed with soft needles. I could hear the wind brushing through the treetops, a faint rushing sound that never stopped. There were no other tire tracks nearby, no fire pits, no litter. I liked that. It meant no one else had been there for a while. After setting up camp, I gathered a small pile of firewood and stacked it by a rock circle I made myself. The air smelled clean, a mix of pine sap and cold earth. I sat on the tailgate of the truck eating a sandwich, watching the light move between the trees. The place was peaceful, but the quiet had a kind of heaviness to it, like it pressed against my ears. It wasn't just the absence of people. It was the kind of quiet that makes you start hearing your own heartbeat. That first night was colder than I expected. I crawled into my sleeping bag and left a small fire burning low outside. Through the tent fabric, I could see the faint flicker of orange. I lay there listening to the wind, a few crackling branches, and the occasional creak of the trees. Every sound felt sharper in the dark. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight. When I woke, it was still dark. My watch said 3:47 a.m. The fire had burned out completely, but I could hear something. Faint movement outside. It was small, soft, and slow. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a deer. I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped, then came again, closer to the tent. It was the light crunch of needles, one step at a time. I waited for it to pass, but it just stopped completely a few feet from me. Then nothing. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, staring at the outline of the tent wall, trying to control my breathing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal and forced myself back to sleep. In the morning, I went out to look. The ground was too covered with pine needles to see clear prints, but I noticed something strange. One of the firewood pieces had been moved a few feet from the pile. I hadn't done that. I stood there staring at it, thinking maybe a raccoon had dragged it off, but it seemed odd. It wasn't chewed or scratched, just shifted. I brushed it off and spent the rest of the day hiking a few miles around the area, taking pictures of the streams and moss-covered rocks. It was quiet, too quiet sometimes. I didn't see another person all day. That night, I built a bigger fire and cooked a can of soup. As darkness settled again, I noticed how much colder it got once the sun disappeared. The forest around me was nothing but black between the flickers of firelight. I sat with my back to the truck, watching the fire die down. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard what sounded like a single snapping branch. Then silence again. The air felt heavier, like the woods were holding their breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went into the tent earlier than usual. I lay awake, listening, every tiny sound amplified by the dark. Hours passed. Then, faintly, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, careful, not animal-like, not scattered or four-legged. It was steady, almost deliberate, crunching softly on the needles just outside the tent. I felt my body lock up. Whoever or whatever it was moving around the campsite. I could hear small shifts in the gravel near the fire pit, then closer to the truck. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. The footsteps stopped again. Then came a metallic clink, the sound of my truck door handle being tried. Once, then again. A long pause. I didn't move. I just lay there, every muscle tense, staring into the darkness. The handle rattled one more time, and then everything went silent. I stayed awake until the first light of morning started to push through the trees. When I finally went out, my stomach dropped. The driver's side door of the truck was slightly open. I hadn't left it that way. Inside, the glove box was open, and some of the things inside, maps, papers, a flashlight, were scattered on the seat. Nothing was stolen, not even the wallet I had in the center console. It felt like someone had been looking for something, or maybe just wanted me to know they'd been there. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed up everything as quickly as I could. The entire time I was breaking down the tent, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there. The woods looked normal, calm, bright, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept hearing faint cracks and rustles far off in the trees. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it wasn't. When I finally got in the truck and started driving back down that narrow dirt road, I felt a mix of relief and paranoia. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see a figure stepping out of the woods behind me. The forest seemed endless again, the road winding forever. A few miles down, I noticed something strange. On the right side of the road, there was a small clearing, one I was sure hadn't been there on the way in. In that clearing stood a tent. A single dark green tent, almost identical to mine. Outside of it, a folding chair and a small campfire pit that looked freshly used. There was no car, no cooler, no sign of anyone. Just that tent sitting there like someone had just stepped away for a moment. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I kept my eyes straight on the road and didn't look back until I reached the main highway. By the time I got home, it was almost dark again. I unloaded my things quickly, but when I went to lock the truck, I noticed something on the back window. A faint handprint, smeared in dirt, right above where I had slept in the tent the night before. It wasn't mine. I sold that truck 2 weeks later. I haven't gone camping alone since. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember that sound, the slow, steady crunch of footsteps circling my tent, and the way the door handle rattled in the dark. I'll never know who or what it was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. I went camping alone in the late summer of 2018, just a few miles outside a small town in northern Colorado. I was 26 then, restless and tired of being indoors all the time. I had just quit a job I hated, and I told myself I needed a few days in the woods to reset. I packed my old tent, a small cooler, some canned food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a cheap folding chair. The plan was simple: hike out to a small clearing by a stream I'd seen on a map, stay 3 nights, and come back feeling a little more human. The dirt road I drove down was rough and narrow. I didn't see another car the entire drive-in, just old tire ruts and a few deer crossing signs. It was already late afternoon when I parked at the end of the road and hiked in with my gear. The forest was dry and quiet except for the sound of insects. The ground crunched under my boots, pine needles breaking with every step. I followed a barely visible path down toward the stream and found a small flat patch of dirt between some tall pines. It wasn't the most comfortable spot, but it was hidden and had just enough room for the tent. I set up camp, boiled some water, and ate from a can of beans while the sun dropped behind the ridge. The forest grew darker fast, the air turning colder than I expected. When I turned off my flashlight, the darkness felt solid, almost heavy. I could hear the steady running of the stream nearby and the occasional snap of branches from somewhere in the woods. I told myself it was just animals. I didn't have much of an imagination for scary things, but there was something uneasy about how the sound carried in that place. Everything echoed, like the trees were closer than they really were. The first night went fine. I woke up a few times because of noises, branches breaking, something brushing against my tent, but I figured it was raccoons or maybe a deer. In the morning, I noticed a few small marks in the dirt near where I'd left my backpack. They looked like shoe prints, but smaller, maybe a kid's size, and going in odd directions. The ground was dry and hard, so they weren't clear enough to tell. I thought maybe I had stepped there myself while setting up and just didn't remember. I spent most of that day walking along the stream, collecting firewood and exploring. The water was shallow and cold, clear enough to see every rock on the bottom. There was a fallen tree crossing over it that looked like it had been there for years. I crossed to the other side and followed a faint animal trail up a slope, where I found an old fire pit made from stones. It looked like someone had camped there a long time ago. There were bits of rusted metal, a crushed beer can half buried in dirt, and what looked like a torn piece of fabric tangled around a log. By sunset, I was back at my camp. I made a small fire and sat watching it burn down to embers. The forest felt quieter that night, like everything around had gone still. The air didn't move much, and the stream sound was the only steady thing. I sat for a long time listening, trying to get used to the isolation. I thought I heard something across the stream, a soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled through the leaves, but it would stop every time I tried to focus on it. Later, I was lying inside the tent when I heard what sounded like footsteps. Not heavy, but definite. A few slow steps, then silence. Then again, a few more. I turned off my small lantern and waited. I could hear my own breathing too loud in the tent. The steps moved closer, stopping just beyond the thin wall of fabric. I didn't move. My mind ran through every explanation I could. An animal, maybe a lost hiker, but the steps sounded deliberate, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. After a while, they stopped. I stayed awake for hours, gripping my small camping knife, staring at the ceiling of the tent until morning light finally came. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw were more footprints. They were human, smaller than mine, and circled halfway around my camp before heading toward the stream. The prints were fresh, pressed into the soft dirt that had been damp from morning dew. I packed my things slowly that morning, planning to leave early, but I hesitated. I felt stupid for being scared. I told myself someone must have wandered near my camp during the night, maybe even curious about the light from my fire. There were old trails everywhere, maybe a hunter or someone camping nearby. I decided to stay one more night, mostly out of pride. I moved my tent a little closer to the trees for more cover and gathered more firewood than before. As the day went on, I kept glancing toward the stream, trying to see if anyone was out there. Once, I thought I saw something move through the trees on the opposite bank. Just a flicker of color like clothing, but when I stared, it was gone. When night came, I built a stronger fire. The smoke drifted upward in a slow column. I ate, cleaned up, and kept the knife beside me. Hours passed with nothing happening, and I started to relax. The forest sounds returned. Crickets, frogs, and the constant rush of the stream. I sat there, staring into the fire until my eyes burned from the light. Then, from somewhere across the stream, came a sharp metallic sound, like something striking metal once, then silence. I froze, waiting. Then it came again, softer. I turned off my lantern and listened. The woods were so dark that I couldn't see past the glow of the fire. For several minutes, nothing. Then, a small crunch of footsteps, this time moving along the edge of the stream. I stood up, slowly, and watched the direction of the sound. The steps paused, and I could barely make out a shape. A person crouched low, unmoving. My stomach tightened. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the shape. The beam caught something pale for just a second before it dropped out of sight. I heard splashing water and then nothing. I stood there shaking, waiting for them to appear again, but they never did. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going until morning and packed before the sun was fully up. When I went to the stream to fill my bottle, I noticed something on the opposite bank. An old camping stove half buried in mud, a torn backpack strap, and what looked like a shoe. A small one, the same size as those prints I had seen. The shoe was worn down, the fabric shredded. The hike back to my car felt much longer than before. I kept glancing behind me every few minutes, feeling like someone was watching from the trees. When I finally reached the road, my car was untouched, but there were marks in the dust near the rear bumper. Footprints again, small and close together, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until I hit pavement. I didn't look back again until I was miles away. A week later, I tried to find any mention online about someone missing from that area, or maybe old reports of campers, but nothing matched. The forest had no records, no reports, just a few old stories of hunters seeing abandoned campsites or finding torn-up gear. I never went camping again after that. Sometimes I still think about those prints around my tent, about how small they were, and how quiet whoever it was moved through the woods that night. What keeps me up isn't what they were doing out there. It's knowing how close they got without me ever hearing them breathe. I went camping alone in the summer of 2018, somewhere deep in the forests of northern Montana. I was 28 at the time, and I had been going through one of those stretches of life where everything just felt heavy and loud. I wanted silence. I wanted a break from people, screens, and noise. I'd done solo camping trips before, but never this far out. The spot I picked wasn't a real campground. It was a flat stretch of clearing near a river, surrounded by dense pine trees that looked the same in every direction. I had marked the spot on my GPS, but other than that, I didn't have a signal. The nearest road was about 4 miles away. That was exactly what I wanted, just isolation and quiet. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent near the tree line, cooked some beans and rice on a small stove, and sat by the river until the sun went down. The sound of the water rushing past and the faint whistle of wind through the pines was calming. I stayed awake for a while after dark, just listening to the forest. There were insects, owls, and once or twice the sharp crack of a branch breaking somewhere off in the distance. But that didn't bother me. Forests make noises. I fell asleep easily that night, feeling like I'd finally escaped the noise of the world. The second day started normal too. I hiked along the river, took some pictures, filled my bottle, and explored deeper into the woods. Around late afternoon, I came across something strange. About 2 miles upriver, there was an old, half-collapsed wooden structure. It looked like a hunting shack or maybe an old storage shed. The roof was mostly gone, and part of the front wall had caved in. The air around it smelled like wet wood and rot. Inside, I saw broken shelves, some rusted tools, and a metal bucket filled with muddy rainwater. On the floor, half buried in dirt and leaves, was an old boot, just one, and a few bones scattered nearby. They looked like animal bones at first glance, but one of them was too thick and straight to be from a deer. I didn't stay long enough to think too much about it. I backed out and went back to camp before it got dark. That night, I couldn't relax as easily. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. It was quieter, not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the faint hiss of the river and the occasional pop from my fire. When I finally lay in my tent, I kept hearing something faint, a soft, rhythmic sound. It wasn't constant. It came and went. It reminded me of slow footsteps in the grass, too heavy to be an animal like a raccoon, too soft to be something large like a bear. I told myself it was nothing, maybe branches shifting, maybe water trickling. I rolled over and tried to sleep, but every little sound made me open my eyes again. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of snapping twigs nearby. It wasn't close enough to be right outside the tent, but it was close enough to hear clearly. I froze. I listened for what felt like minutes, trying not to breathe too loudly. Then everything went silent again. No wind, no river, no sound at all. My chest felt tight. I didn't move until I saw the faint gray light of morning through the tent fabric. When I stepped outside, nothing looked different. My fire pit had burned down to cold ash. My food bag was untouched, and there were no footprints around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. I packed up my small stove and decided to spend the day closer to camp. Around noon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On one of the trees near where I'd hung my food bag, there were small marks carved into the bark, straight, vertical lines, maybe 6 or 7 of them, all about the same length. They weren't there the day before. I tried to tell myself they were animal scratches, maybe from a bear, but they looked too neat for that. I took a few steps back and noticed another tree a little farther off had similar marks. Perfectly straight, too deliberate. I felt watched even though I couldn't see anyone. By evening, the wind started picking up, and clouds began rolling in. It smelled like rain. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but the idea of hiking 4 miles through the woods at dusk made me hesitate. I decided to stay one more night, even though everything in my gut told me not to. I double-checked my tent, pulled my pack inside, and kept my hatchet close. When darkness fell, the storm started. It wasn't violent, just steady rain tapping against the tent, mixed with distant thunder. The sound was steady enough that I actually started to doze off. At some point after midnight, I woke up again, not from thunder, but from a noise that cut through the rain. It sounded like something metallic being dragged across the ground. A long, slow scraping sound. It stopped after a few seconds, then started again, closer this time. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to look out. The rain was lighter now, and the moon was faintly visible through the clouds. The forest looked darker than I'd ever seen it. I didn't see anyone or anything, just my gear, the trees, and the wet ground reflecting bits of moonlight. Then I saw it, near one of the trees with the carved marks, something long and shiny lying in the dirt. It looked like a crowbar or a metal rod. I hadn't seen it there before. I stayed awake until morning, gripping my hatchet and waiting for any sound. Nothing else happened. When the sun came up, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't clean up, just folded the tent wet and threw it into my pack. I started hiking back toward the road. Every sound behind me made me turn. A few times, I thought I heard footsteps matching mine. Not close, but following at the same pace. I didn't stop to check. I just kept walking faster, trying to stay calm. The trees all looked the same, and I had to keep checking my GPS to make sure I was still on track. When I finally reached my car, I felt the heaviest kind of relief I've ever felt. The first thing I did was check the trunk, the back seat, every inch of it, before even getting inside. Nothing. I drove straight into the nearest town, stopped at a diner, and sat there for an hour just drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. I went through my phone later that day and looked at the pictures I'd taken on the hike. Trees, river, sky, and that old shack. I was swiping through when one photo made me stop cold. It was a shot I didn't remember taking. It showed my tent, my exact setup, from a distance, like someone had taken it from the woods while I was inside. I deleted every photo, sold the tent a week later, and I haven't camped alone since. I still don't know who was out there that night, or how long they'd been watching me, but sometimes when I wake up at night, I still hear that faint metallic scraping sound in my head, slow and steady, like something being dragged just out of sight. I went camping alone in the late summer of 2019. somewhere deep in the forests near Central Oregon. I had driven out there after work on a Friday, my car loaded with a tent, some food, and a small cooler with drinks. I had been wanting to do a solo trip for a long time, something quiet, away from the constant noise of people and traffic. I wasn't exactly an expert camper, but I knew the basics: how to pitch a tent, build a small fire, and keep food sealed away from animals. The plan was simple: spend 2 nights out there, fish in the nearby creek, read a book, and just be alone. I didn't tell many people where I was going. I just wanted some peace. The forest was thick and quiet, with tall pines that blocked most of the sky. The dirt road leading to the spot was rough and narrow, lined with dry brush that scraped against the sides of my car. The campsite I picked was a few hundred feet from an old logging trail that didn't look like it had been used in years. I liked that. No signs of people, no tire tracks, no noise. The air smelled like dry wood and pine needles, and the late afternoon sun flickered through the branches in strips of orange light. I set up my tent near a small clearing and gathered some dead branches for a fire. Everything felt normal at first, calm and still. The first night went fine. I cooked a small meal, sat by the fire, and watched the stars. It got cold quickly after sunset, colder than I expected. The forest grew completely silent, not even crickets after a while. I could hear the faint sound of the creek down the slope, but otherwise it was just the fire crackling and the wind brushing through the trees. When I finally went to sleep, I remember how black it was inside the tent. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The air was damp and heavy, and at one point during the night, I thought I heard something moving outside the tent. Just a few soft crunches of leaves, then nothing. Probably a deer or raccoon, I thought. I didn't move, just listened, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning was bright but cold. I walked down to the creek with a small fishing rod, followed the sound of water until I found it winding between mossy rocks. The water was clear and freezing. I stayed there for hours, catching nothing but enjoying the quiet. It was peaceful, but there was something slightly off I couldn't explain. Every once in a while, I felt like I was being watched. Not in a paranoid way at first, more like that faint pressure you feel when someone's eyes are on you. I'd look around and see nothing but trees, shadows, and the occasional movement of a squirrel or bird. I told myself it was just the silence getting to me. When you're alone for long enough, every little noise feels bigger. When I went back to camp that afternoon, I noticed something strange. One of the straps on my cooler had come loose, and the lid was half open. Inside, one of the food containers was missing. I knew I'd closed it tight before leaving. I looked around the camp for signs of an animal. Scratches, paw prints, anything. But the ground was too dry to hold tracks. I figured maybe a raccoon had gotten bold while I was gone. It was annoying, but not a big deal. Still, it made me a little uneasy. I double-checked everything before sunset, tied up the food, and even moved the cooler into the trunk of my car just to be safe. That night, I sat by the fire again, trying to shake the weird feeling that had been creeping in all day. The woods were so quiet it started to feel wrong. Usually you'd hear something, bugs, birds, anything, but there was just this thick silence. Around 10 or so, I decided to go to bed. I zipped the tent shut, crawled into my sleeping bag, and lay there listening to the faint rustle of leaves. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to the sound of slow, heavy steps outside my tent. They weren't fast or animal-like. They were spaced apart, steady, and deliberate. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like it filled my whole chest. I stayed completely still, breathing through my nose as quietly as I could. The footsteps stopped right beside the tent. I could hear the faint crunch of dirt and the shifting sound of fabric brushing against the nylon wall. Whoever it was, they were standing just a foot or two away from me. My hand slowly moved toward the flashlight near my sleeping bag, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't even dare move the zipper. Then I heard a soft metallic sound. Something clicking, like a knife being opened or a piece of metal being adjusted. My throat went dry. The air inside the tent felt suffocating. I wanted to shout or run, but I didn't know which direction to go. I just stayed frozen, waiting. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. Then the footsteps started again, this time slower, moving around the tent. I could feel the ground slightly vibrate under each step. The person walked a full circle around me and then stopped again near the back. For what felt like forever, there was nothing but the sound of my breathing. Eventually, the steps faded away toward the trees. I waited at least 15 minutes before unzipping the tent slightly, just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing coals, and the forest was pitch black beyond that faint red light. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything, but the hair on my arms stayed standing up. I didn't sleep again after that. I sat there in the dark with the flashlight in my hand until the first light of morning came through the tent fabric. As soon as the sun was up, I got out and looked around. I found boot prints in the dirt, clear ones, heavy, deep treads, not mine. They led from the edge of the woods straight to my tent and then off toward the trail. No sign of anyone else, no car sounds, nothing. My hands were shaking as I packed my gear. I didn't even make breakfast. I just threw everything into the trunk and left. The drive out felt longer than when I came in. Every bend in the dirt road looked like a place where someone could be standing, watching. When I finally hit the main highway, I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly 40 miles away. I parked by the pumps, locked the doors, and just sat there trying to process it. I thought about calling someone, the police maybe, but what would I even say? Some stranger walked around my tent in the woods? No proof, no name, no damage done. Just boot prints and fear. I never went camping alone again after that. For months, I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking I heard those slow footsteps again. That steady crunch of dirt outside my window or on the driveway. The image that still sticks with me the most isn't even the sound. It's that exact moment when I realized it wasn't an animal, that someone had walked all the way out there, in the middle of nowhere, just to stand beside my tent. No one else around for miles. No reason at all. Just silence and then gone. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 26 then, working in a small construction company in Northern Oregon, and I wanted a quiet weekend away from everything. No phone, no noise, no people. I had camped before, but always with friends or family. This time I wanted to do it on my own, just to see if I could handle it. I picked a place I had seen on an old hiking map called Miller Ridge, a stretch of forest land about 20 miles off the main highway. It wasn't an official campground, more like an area where hunters and a few hikers went. I packed my small tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a cheap camping stove. I left my apartment early in the morning and drove for almost 4 hours until the paved road turned into a rocky path. The forest there was thick and deep, mostly pine and cedar. It felt quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing and even the buzz of a fly sounds loud. I parked my car at a small clearing and started walking deeper with my backpack. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles, and every step gave a faint crunch. I could smell the sap and the damp earth. After about an hour of walking, I found a spot by a small stream. The water was slow and shallow, enough to clean things and maybe wash my hands. I set up my tent under a large pine, unpacked my food, and made a small fire using dry sticks. The first day was calm. I sat by the fire until evening, listening to the sound of the water and the rustle of branches. When it got dark, I crawled into my sleeping bag and lay there, staring at the thin nylon roof of the tent, hearing the forest move around me. The small things that live in the night. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets. The next morning was gray and cold. I boiled water on the stove and drank instant coffee while watching the fog move between the trees. Felt peaceful. I decided to hike further uphill to see what was around. The trail was faint but still visible, and after maybe 40 minutes, I came across an old, half-collapsed wooden structure. Looked like a hunting shack or maybe an old storage hut. The roof had caved in and the wood was dark with age. Inside, there was an old metal chair, a rusted lantern, and some crushed beer cans. I stood there for a while, just looking. There were marks on one of the walls, deep scratches going up and down, not from an animal, but like someone had done it with a tool or knife. I didn't think much of it. People do weird things when they're alone in the woods. I walked back to my camp before noon. That evening, the forest changed. The air got heavier and colder. The wind picked up and I noticed that the sounds were different. Less insect noise, more stillness. I tried to ignore it, ate some noodles, and sat near the fire until it got dark. Around 10 p.m., I heard something moving on the other side of the stream. It wasn't a small sound. It was heavy, slow, like someone stepping carefully through wet leaves. I turned off my headlamp and listened. It stopped. I waited a while, then turned the light back on. Nothing. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to sleep even though my chest felt tight. I woke up in the middle of the night because I heard something again. Not walking this time, but a faint clicking sound, like two small stones being tapped together. It went on for a few seconds, then stopped, then started again. I sat up quietly inside the tent. The sound was close, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I didn't move. My hands were sweating even though it was cold. Then the clicking stopped, and after a long silence, I heard a slow exhale, like someone breathing out heavily through their nose. I froze. My first thought was a bear, but it didn't sound like one. I reached for the hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag and just stayed still for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the sounds faded. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I checked around my camp. I expected to see animal prints or something, but the ground was just soft dirt. No clear tracks, no disturbed branches. But there was something else. A piece of twine tied around a small branch right near my tent. It wasn't mine. It looked freshly cut, clean and tight, like someone had placed it there on purpose. My stomach dropped. I didn't understand why anyone would do that. I started thinking maybe someone had been out there watching me. I decided to leave that day, but my car was a good hour's walk away. I packed quickly, stuffed everything into my bag, and started moving fast along the same trail I'd come from. The forest felt different now. Every sound made me turn around. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like something was following just out of sight. At one point, I thought I saw movement behind a tree far back, just a flicker of something dark. But when I stopped, it was gone. Halfway back, I found something else that made my skin crawl. There was a small pile of rocks on the side of the trail, stacked neatly, with a single piece of red cloth tied around the top one. It wasn't there when I had walked in. I stood there staring at it for a long time, feeling my heartbeat in my neck. I didn't touch it. I just kept walking faster, almost jogging, until I reached the clearing where I had parked. My car door was open. I knew I had locked it before leaving. The driver's door was hanging half shut, and inside, everything from the glove box was scattered over the seats. My backpack straps were still wet with sweat, and my hands were shaking as I checked the back seat. Nothing was missing, but the strange part was that someone had moved the driver's seat all the way back, like a much taller person had been sitting there. I started the car immediately. The tires threw up dirt as I reversed onto the rocky road. I didn't look back. I drove until I hit the highway and didn't stop until I reached a gas station 30 miles away. I parked near the lights and just sat there for a long time, breathing, trying to convince myself that I wasn't overreacting. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Someone had been out there. Someone had been moving around my camp that night, tying things, clicking rocks, maybe even watching me from the dark. I never went back to Miller Ridge. A few months later, out of curiosity, I looked it up online. There were a couple of old mentions on hiking forums, people saying they had found signs of someone living off-grid there years ago, some sort of recluse who didn't like strangers around. No one had posted about it recently. Even now, when I go camping with friends, I can't sleep properly. I always keep the car close, the tent door facing it, and I never go alone anymore. The sound that keeps coming back to me is that faint clicking in the dark, slow and deliberate, like someone trying to see if I was awake. I went camping alone in northern Montana in the summer of 2014. I was 28 at the time and had been working a desk job for years. I needed to clear my head, to get away from people, from traffic, from the sound of my phone buzzing every few minutes. I picked a remote area near a small lake surrounded by pine forest, about 2 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't an official campsite, just a patch of clearing I had found a year earlier when I went fishing with a friend. Back then, it seemed peaceful. This time, it felt different from the moment I arrived. I parked my old truck off a narrow dirt road and carried my gear down to the lake. The air smelled sharp with pine and mud. There was still snow melting on the mountains far off in the distance, and the air felt colder than I expected, even in July. The lake's surface was still and dark, almost mirror-like, reflecting the heavy clouds overhead. It was the kind of quiet that feels thick. No wind, no insects, nothing but the soft crunch of my boots. I set up camp close to the water, far enough from the trees to avoid anything falling during the night, but still near enough for firewood. My tent was small, just big enough for one person and my backpack. I had packed light sleeping bag, stove, lantern, knife, first aid kit, and a few meals sealed in bags. I built a small fire pit with stones, gathered dry branches, and lit the fire before it got dark. As the flames caught, the orange light flickered over the tree trunks, stretching and shrinking as if the forest itself was breathing. After dinner, I sat near the fire with a cup of instant coffee. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the temperature sank fast. I watched the fire crackle until it burned low, then walked to the water's edge. The reflection of the stars rippled across the surface. It was beautiful in a lonely sort of way. I remember feeling small, like the woods were swallowing me. When I finally got into my tent, the ground felt colder than usual, and I could hear the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. First, I didn't know why. My heart was pounding like I'd just run. I lay still, listening. The fire outside was dead, and the only sound I could hear was the faint rustling of the tarp on my tent. Then, beneath that, I heard a soft splash. It was faint but close. I thought maybe it was a fish or a frog. I told myself that and tried to calm down. Then came another splash, heavier this time. Something moving in the water. I slowly unzipped the tent door just enough to peek outside. The moon was bright enough that I could see the edge of the lake, pale and silver. The trees stood black against the sky. Nothing moved. I listened for a full minute, holding my breath. Then, a slow scraping sound came from the shore, like something dragging along the wet rocks. I froze completely. The sound stopped, and I sat there, half out of the tent, staring toward the lake. My skin was crawling. I couldn't see anything, but I felt sure something was there. After a few minutes, the sound stopped completely. I closed the tent, crawled back into my sleeping bag, and tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But my body stayed tense for hours. I must have dozed off sometime near dawn because when I woke up again, sunlight was leaking through the tent walls. Outside, the first thing I noticed was that there were footprints near the water. Not animal prints, bare feet. Human. The mud was soft, and I could see the shape of toes clearly. The steps came out of the water and stopped a few feet before my tent. There were 3 prints, spaced apart like someone had taken careful steps before turning back into the lake. I stood there staring for a long time, my stomach tightening. The water was still. No ripples, no sound. I told myself maybe they were old prints, maybe from some other camper, though I knew no one else ever came out here. I walked the entire perimeter of the lake that morning, scanning for other signs. Boot prints, tire marks, litter, anything. There was nothing, only those bare footprints, leading from the water and back into it. That afternoon, I decided to stay one more night but move my tent farther up the slope, away from the lake. I told myself it was just for a better view, though really I wanted distance. The air was still cold, and by evening a thin fog drifted over the lake. I made a larger fire that night and kept it burning brighter. I didn't want darkness pressing too close. As I sat there, I heard something faint again. Branches cracking, slow footsteps somewhere beyond the firelight. They weren't near the water this time, but deeper in the trees. I stood up, holding my flashlight, scanning the woods. The light bounced off trunks and low brush but caught nothing moving. The steps stopped, and everything went dead silent. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I stood there, barely breathing myself, listening so hard my ears hurt. Then I saw something low to the ground, far back between 2 trees. A dark shape, still as stone. It wasn't an animal. The shape didn't match. It was too human, too motionless. I didn't move. I kept the light pointed at that spot for maybe 30 seconds, but the fog thickened, and I lost sight of it. The forest swallowed the light. That was the moment I decided to leave. I didn't pack properly. I threw my gear into the truck, barely folding the tent, and left the fire burning down to embers. The tires slid on the dirt as I reversed out. My hands were shaking the whole drive down the narrow road. When I finally reached the paved highway, I looked back once. Through the side mirror, I could still see the glow of my fire reflecting on the fog near the lake. Something about that image made my chest feel hollow. 2 days later, I came back with a park ranger. I told him I thought someone had been camping illegally near the lake. When we got there, the fire pit was cold, and the footprints were gone. But the ranger found something half buried in the mud near the waterline. A torn piece of cloth, faded and stiff, stuck to a rock. It looked old, maybe years old. Later, I found out that in the 1990s, a man went missing near that same lake. They said he drowned while fishing alone, but his body was never recovered. I don't know if it was him or just some trick of the woods, but I haven't gone camping alone since. Even now, when I think about that quiet scraping sound outside my tent, I still feel the same tightness in my chest. It wasn't ghosts or anything impossible. It was something real, something that reminded me that the woods don't care if you're there or not. That night, standing by the lake with my flashlight shaking in my hand, I realized that silence can hide anything, and sometimes it's better not to find out what. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in the northern part of Wyoming. I had been working construction all summer, and I just wanted to get away from everything for a while. I had this small patch of land near the Shoshone National Forest that I'd been to before with a few friends, but this time I wanted to do it alone. I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, a small gas stove, and a cooler full of food, then left early in the morning in my old Ford Ranger. It was one of those mornings where the air feels cool and dry, the kind that makes you want to breathe deep. The road started to thin out the further north. I went until it was just a narrow dirt path surrounded by tall pines and rocky slopes. By the time I got to the clearing, it was past noon. The sun was high, but it didn't feel hot, just bright and quiet. I set up camp beside a creek that ran down from the hills. The sound of the water was steady, and it gave the place this calm feeling. I pitched my tent a few yards from the tree line, close enough to see the water but far enough to feel tucked in. I gathered firewood, arranged some stones for a fire pit, and spent the rest of the afternoon walking along the creek, trying to spot fish or animal tracks. There were signs of elk around, hoof marks, droppings, and some clawed bark from where they'd rubbed their antlers. I even found a few sets of boot prints near the water, maybe from hunters or hikers, though they looked a little older. That didn't bother me much. People came through these parts all the time during fall. As the sun started dropping behind the hills, the temperature dropped fast. I cooked a small meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the woods change sounds. When you're out there long enough, you can hear the forest switch from daytime to night. The birds fade away, replaced by insects and the distant cracking of branches as animals start moving around. It was dark by 9. I crawled into my tent with my flashlight and a small pocket knife I kept nearby out of habit. The forest at night always made me uneasy, but it was something I'd learned to live with. The silence between the wind gusts and the creek's noise had its own rhythm. I must have fallen asleep around 10 because I woke up to the sound of something crunching near the fire pit. The fire had burned down to nothing but dim embers, and I could only see the orange glow flickering through the tent wall. The sound was steady, slow steps moving around. At first, I thought it might have been a deer or maybe a raccoon. I listened for a while, trying not to move, and then it stopped completely. The forest went still again, except for the faint running of the creek. I told myself it was probably nothing and went back to sleep. But an hour or so later, I woke up again. This time, I heard something closer, right outside the tent. The sound of breathing, not deep or loud, but close. It was heavy and uneven, like someone trying to breathe quietly but still struggling. My heart was pounding. I reached slowly for the flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it at the tent wall. The light cast a pale glow, but I couldn't see anything beyond the fabric. I sat completely still for maybe 2 minutes, and the breathing stopped. Eventually, I heard faint crunching footsteps moving away into the woods. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then unzipped the tent just a bit to look outside. The fire pit was dead out, the ground was dark, and there was no movement anywhere. I stayed awake for hours after that, gripping the flashlight until morning light started coming through the tent. When I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was a set of footprints in the dirt near my tent. Bare feet, long, narrow prints leading from the edge of the woods straight toward my campsite, then circling around before heading back toward the trees. They weren't animal tracks. They were definitely human. I tried to tell myself it might have been some lost hiker, but something about the way they stopped so close to my tent made my stomach twist. I decided to stay one more night, mostly because it felt stupid to pack up in the middle of the day over something that might have just been a random person passing through. I went about my day like normal, fishing in the creek, hiking a bit, taking pictures of the ridge line, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. Every time I looked at the tree line, I felt like someone could be standing just behind it, watching. That night, I built a bigger fire and stayed up later. I wanted to stay awake long enough to see if whoever had been there would come back. Around midnight, the fire was still burning strong, and the forest was silent except for a light breeze. Then I heard a noise again, something soft, like a dragging sound on the dirt. Not footsteps exactly, more like someone pulling something heavy. It came from the same direction as before, from the woods behind my tent. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam caught the edge of a branch, some leaves, and nothing else. The dragging sound stopped immediately. I stood there, frozen, listening so hard my ears started ringing. Then came a different sound, a low, faint splash in the creek. I turned toward it, aiming the light at the water, but again saw nothing. I waited, still holding the flashlight, until my arms started to ache. Eventually, I went back into the tent, but I didn't sleep. Every little sound made me tense up. Around 3 a.m., the dragging sound came again, much closer this time, just beyond the tent. It moved slowly, circling, then stopped completely. I could hear soft breathing again, right outside the fabric. My body went cold. I didn't move or even blink. I waited, counting seconds, until I heard the slow crunch of feet moving away into the trees again. When morning came, I stepped out and found more tracks, bare footprints again, leading right up to the tent. But this time, there was something else. A long, shallow groove in the dirt, like something heavy had been pulled along the ground. It led from the trees to the back of my tent and then back into the woods. I followed it for about 30 feet before it disappeared into the undergrowth. That was enough for me. I packed everything up as fast as I could, threw my gear into the truck, and drove out. On the way down the dirt road, I kept checking my rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later that week, I told one of the local rangers about it. He said they'd found signs of someone camping illegally deeper in the woods, makeshift shelters made of branches and tarps, and food wrappers scattered around. He said sometimes people who live off the grid wander close to campsites to scavenge. They usually keep to themselves. That explanation made sense, but it didn't make me feel better. I kept thinking about those bare footprints, how close they had been to my tent, and that dragging sound in the middle of the night. Whatever that person was doing out there, they weren't just passing through. I haven't camped alone since. Sometimes when I drive past a forest at night, I still think about that sound, the slow dragging across the dirt, and how close it was. I try not to imagine what might have happened if I had unzipped the tent that night. It was early September of 2012 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the northern woods of Minnesota. I was 28 then, recently laid off from a warehouse job, living alone in a small apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a home. I needed to get away, even just for a few days. No phone, no people, no noise except the wind and the river. I packed my old canvas tent, a small propane stove, 2 days worth of canned food, and my fishing rod. I wanted quiet, and I got more than I could have ever wanted. I drove for almost 5 hours from Duluth, taking smaller and smaller roads until I was driving down a narrow dirt path surrounded by endless trees. The forest there was dense and untouched, and the deeper I went, the more it felt like stepping out of the world. No cell signal, no signs, no tire marks, just the crunch of gravel under my truck tires. I parked beside a clearing near a slow-moving river and set up camp right at the edge of the treeline. The air smelled sharp, like pine and wet earth, and the water made a soft sound that never stopped. The first day went smooth. I hiked for a few miles, fished, and read while the sun went down. I built a small fire and sat beside it, watching the woods turn darker until the flames were the only light around me. When I went to sleep, it was silent except for the river. I remember thinking that it was the first time in months I'd felt peace. That peace didn't last through the night. Sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly, like something had pulled me out of sleep. The fire was out, the inside of the tent was pitch black, and the only sound was the wind brushing through the trees. I didn't know what woke me, but I had this cold, uneasy feeling in my stomach. Then I heard something. Not close at first, something like a short, hard crack. A branch snapping. Then another. It wasn't a squirrel or small animal. It was heavy, slow. The steps didn't sound like a deer either. It moved in bursts, stopping for long stretches, as if it was listening or watching. I laid still, barely breathing, telling myself it was probably a bear or maybe a raccoon rummaging through my stuff. But it didn't sound like rummaging. The steps circled my tent once, slow and deliberate, crushing the leaves with a deep sound that made the nylon of the tent shake slightly each time. My mouth went dry. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to look, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. I stayed perfectly still, waiting. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The air outside went dead silent. Not even the river seemed to move. I waited at least an hour before I could finally fall back asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I found large shoe prints around the tent. They weren't animal tracks, they were from boots. Deep, clear imprints in the soft dirt, some overlapping my own from the day before. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were mine. But they weren't. The rest of that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there watching me. Every time I looked into the tree line, it felt like something was moving just far enough back to stay unseen. I packed up some of my things, deciding to fish a little longer before heading out the next day. Around late afternoon, while I was sitting by the river, I saw something on the opposite bank. It looked like a piece of fabric caught in a branch. I thought it was trash at first, but when I looked closer, it was a torn strip of blue cloth, like from a shirt or jacket, hung deliberately on a low branch. It wasn't there the day before. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold beans straight from the can and stayed inside the tent, listening. For hours, I didn't hear anything, and I started to think maybe I just scared myself over nothing. But then, around midnight, the sounds came again, this time closer. It started with the sound of footsteps in the leaves, moving slowly toward the tent. Then there was the soft clink of metal, like someone brushing against a camping tool. I could hear breathing now, faint but steady. Whoever it was, they were just outside the thin fabric wall. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I reached slowly for the hunting knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. I held it tight and waited. The sound circled again, slow and patient, and then stopped right near the entrance. I could see the faint shadow of something through the fabric, just a shape, barely visible. It didn't move. I didn't either. We both stayed like that for what felt like forever. Then, without warning, something pressed against the side of the tent. A hand. I saw the clear outline of fingers press into the nylon, just a few inches from my face. My whole body froze. I didn't think. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, ripped open the zipper, and bolted out barefoot into the cold night. The air was wet and heavy, my heart pounding so hard it drowned everything else out. I swung the light wildly across the trees. Nothing. The clearing was empty. I turned in circles, shaking, waiting for something to move, but there was only the dark. I ran to my truck and locked the doors. I sat there until the first gray light of morning started showing through the windshield. When I finally got the nerve to get out, I noticed something by the tent. Two long, deep boot prints right where I'd seen the hand press in. The rest of the ground around it was smooth, like someone had brushed over their own tracks. I packed everything fast, shoving my gear into the truck bed without even folding the tent. The whole drive out of those woods, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the road. When I reached the main highway, I didn't stop until I hit town. Later that week, I read a short article online about a missing man, a hiker last seen somewhere around that same stretch of forest. The photo showed a guy wearing a blue jacket, the same color as that strip of fabric I'd seen hanging from the branch. I never went back to camp after that. I sold my tent, my stove, everything. Even now, years later, when I drive past woods or smell wet pine, I still think about those footsteps circling my tent and that hand pressing against the fabric. Whatever was out there that night wasn't an animal, and it wasn't some harmless stranger passing by. It was someone who had been out there long enough to know those woods better than anyone else, and who moved through them without leaving a trace when they wanted to. I made it out, but I still don't know how close I came to not waking up at all. It was late September of 2016 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been working long hours at a construction company in Denver, and my body felt heavy from the routine. The same traffic, the same faces, the same sound of concrete drills every day. I wanted silence. Not the kind that came from staying home, but the kind that came from being deep in the woods where there were no engines, no people, and no streetlights. I picked a spot I'd seen once before. A small clearing near the edge of Route National Forest, close to a narrow stream that cut between a thick wall of trees. I left early in the morning, my old gray Tacoma packed with camping gear, food, and a single rifle I kept for safety. The drive took nearly 5 hours. The air grew colder and sharper the higher I climbed into the mountains. When I turned off the main road onto a dirt path, it felt like entering another world. The road narrowed, and tall pines closed in from both sides. My tires crunched over gravel, and occasionally the sound of a branch brushing the side of the truck broke the silence. By the time I reached the spot, the sun had already slipped low. I parked near a sloped area covered with leaves and pine needles. The air smelled faintly of sap and wet soil. I set up my tent near the edge of the stream, where the water made a steady trickling sound that almost felt alive. I built a small fire, cooked a can of beans, and sat by it until the flames dimmed into orange embers. There was no phone signal, no radio, just the sound of moving water and the faint wind through the branches. I remember lying inside my tent that first night thinking about how freeing it felt. No notifications, no light, just the dark pressing in around me. Around midnight, I woke up for no clear reason. The air inside the tent felt still and colder than before. My first thought was that the fire had died completely, but then I realized something else. It was too quiet. The sound of the stream was still there, faint but steady, yet the woods themselves had gone completely silent. I couldn't hear insects or the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just the temperature drop making animals less active. I lay there for a while, listening. Then I heard something. Not loud, not close, but distinct enough that I froze. It was the sound of dry leaves crunching. It wasn't steady footsteps, more like a few slow, irregular movements, then silence. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. My heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I waited, thinking maybe it was a deer or raccoon, but then the sound came again. A bit closer this time, still slow, as if someone was trying to move quietly but stepping on every loud patch of ground anyway. I stayed still for a long time, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles hurt. Eventually, I heard nothing but the stream again. After what felt like half an hour, I forced myself to relax and drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I walked around the area, trying to convince myself it had been an animal. About 20 feet from my tent, I found some marks in the soil. Not boot prints exactly, but something had definitely pressed down the earth. The shape wasn't clear, like the edges had crumbled overnight. Could have been anything. I told myself it was a deer's hoof or maybe a bare paw print that just didn't hold its shape in the soft dirt. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I decided to stay one more night anyway. I had driven all that way, and part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. The day passed quietly. I collected wood, fished a little in the stream, and wrote a few lines in a small notebook I'd brought along. The forest felt calm under daylight, bright and harmless, like the night before had been some weird dream. But when evening came, the mood shifted again. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. The shadows between them looked darker than usual. When I went to sleep, I left the fire burning low, just enough to give a bit of light outside the tent. I woke up again sometime after midnight, and the first thing I noticed was that the fire had died completely. Everything was black. I lay there staring up at the tent ceiling, half awake, when I heard it again. The crunching sound, this time closer and clearer, stopped, then started again, and I could tell it wasn't small. The steps were slow, uneven, but heavy enough that they sank into the earth. My breathing went shallow. I slowly reached for the rifle beside me. For a few seconds, I thought about shouting, just to scare whatever it was off, but I couldn't make myself do it. The sound stopped right near where the fire had been. I could hear faint shifting, like fabric brushing against itself, or clothes. That's when it hit me, it wasn't an animal. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still. My eyes were open, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint outline of the tent walls. Then, very quietly, something brushed against the fabric of the tent itself. Just a light drag, like a fingertip sliding across. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After a few seconds, it stopped. Then silence again. I don't remember falling asleep. My body must have shut down from exhaustion, because when I opened my eyes again, it was dawn. Pale light spilled into the tent. I unzipped it slowly, every muscle in my body tense. Outside, the grass was damp with dew. Nothing looked disturbed except the ashes of the fire. There were fresh boot prints beside it. Large ones. They led away from my campsite, disappearing into the trees across the stream. I packed everything up in record time. I didn't even bother finishing my breakfast. When I got back to the truck, I checked the windows and locks out of instinct. That's when I noticed something that still bothers me. On the side mirror, smeared faintly into the dirt, was the shape of a handprint. Not clean, but clear enough to tell someone had touched it. I wiped it off with my sleeve, got inside, and drove off without looking back. The whole drive home, I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe a hunter passing through, maybe someone lost, maybe just curiosity. But what made it worse was knowing how far off the trail I'd gone. No one should have been out there, not that deep in the forest. When I got home, I unpacked everything in my garage, and I noticed something else. The small notebook I'd been writing in was gone. It had been in my backpack the whole time. I never went back to that spot again. I still camp sometimes, but always in open areas with other people nearby. Sometimes at night, when the wind is still, I'll wake up thinking I heard the crunch of leaves again. And even though I know I'm far away from that forest, it always takes me a long time to fall back asleep after that. It was late August 2012 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip up in northern Colorado, near the Roosevelt National Forest. I was 29 at the time, living in Fort Collins, working long weeks in a small hardware store. I'd been feeling drained for months, stuck between work and my small apartment, and I just wanted a couple of nights away from noise, traffic, and lights. I borrowed a tent from a coworker and packed up a sleeping bag, a small cooler, a few cans of food, some jerky, and my old hunting knife. My plan was simple: drive up to the mountains, find a quiet spot near a stream, set up camp, and just relax. The drive up was easy. The weather was mild, sky clear, and I reached a small dirt road that led deeper into the forest by noon. There weren't many signs around, and the road looked like it hadn't been used much that summer. I liked that. I parked my car in a small clearing off the road and hiked another half-mile until I found a good spot. The area was quiet except for the sound of water trickling somewhere close by and the occasional rustle of the wind through pine trees. I set up my tent on a small patch of flat ground under a large tree and walked a bit downstream to wash my hands in the cold, clear water. That first day was calm. I collected firewood, set up a small ring of rocks for the fire, and cooked a can of beans and some jerky. The smell of pine and smoke mixed in the air as the light faded, and everything felt peaceful. When night came, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and listened to the forest settling down. The air got colder fast, and I could hear small sounds outside. Maybe small animals moving through the brush, nothing unusual. I fell asleep sometime around 10. I woke up later that night to a noise that didn't fit with the rest. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not one I recognized. It was more like the sound of something heavy brushing against a tree, or maybe the crunch of footsteps on dry pine needles. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe a deer wandering nearby. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had sounded closer than it should have. I stayed awake for a while, staring at the thin wall of the tent, then eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made me uneasy. Near the edge of my camp, about 20 feet from the tent, the ground was disturbed. Not torn up or anything, but there were clear marks in the dirt, like someone had walked around during the night. The steps weren't animal tracks. They looked like boot prints. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to figure out if they could have been mine from the previous day. But they weren't. The tread didn't match my boots, and they circled the area like someone had been walking around the tent, stopping at different spots. It bothered me, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe another hiker passed through and got curious about my setup. I didn't hear anything else that day. I spent most of it hiking up the ridge behind the camp, where the view stretched out over miles of dark green forest. I felt small out there, surrounded by so much quiet. When I got back that evening, the air was still and the sun was dropping behind the trees. I built a small fire, ate, and sat watching the flames flicker. But as the forest got darker, the silence began to feel heavier, almost like the woods were holding their breath. I didn't sleep well that second night. The noises came back. I heard the same soft crunching outside, moving slowly around my tent. I froze, barely breathing. The steps were slow, not panicked, not rushing, like someone walking carefully, trying not to make too much sound. At one point, I thought I heard a quiet thud, like something being set down. Then nothing. I lay there, eyes wide open, for hours until dawn started to creep in through the fabric of the tent. When I finally stepped outside, everything looked normal again. The only difference was that one of the small logs from my fire ring had been moved a few feet away. I knew I should probably pack up and leave, but I didn't. I told myself it was probably just an animal or another camper. I even laughed a bit at how paranoid I was being. I spent the morning fishing in the stream and caught one small trout, which I cooked for lunch. Still, the forest felt different now. Every sound made me glance up. Every gust of wind made me feel watched. That evening, clouds started rolling in, and I could smell rain. I reinforced the tent, gathered extra wood, and tried to make sure everything was dry. When darkness fell, the wind picked up, and rain began tapping on the tent. The fire hissed and died out quickly. I sat inside, listening to the rain, until I heard something over it. Faint, muffled, and wrong. It sounded like a low whistle, drawn out and uneven. Then another. I felt my stomach twist. The rain was loud, but between the gusts, I could hear it again, this time closer, like someone trying to find their way in the dark. I reached for my flashlight and turned it off again almost immediately, afraid of giving away my position. The whistling stopped, replaced by slow movement outside the tent. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it filled the whole space. The sound circled the tent once, then twice. The zipper at the entrance rattled slightly, like someone testing it. I sat completely still, clutching the knife in my hand, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, the sound faded into the rain, moving deeper into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked, and the air was cold. I packed up fast, barely eating anything, and started hiking back to my car. When I reached the dirt road, I saw fresh tire marks, Not mine, not old. They were new, deep in the mud, leading past where I'd parked. My heart sank when I saw the driver's door of my car slightly open. I walked slowly, looking around. The inside was a mess. My cooler was gone, my small knife missing, and even my map had been taken. Someone had gone through everything. I didn't stay to think. I got in, started the engine, and drove until I hit the main road, barely breathing the whole way. I made it back to Fort Collins by evening, parked in front of my apartment, and sat there for a while, just staring at the dashboard. For weeks after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire time out there. Not by some animal, not by anything supernatural, but by a person. Someone who had been close, moving quietly, studying me from the trees, maybe waiting for the right moment. I've never gone camping alone again. Every time I drive into the mountains now, I still think about that third night. The sound of the zipper moving in the dark, the low whistle that carried over the rain, and the footsteps circling the tent while I sat there, pretending not to breathe. It was late September of 2014 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 27, working as a mechanic in a small town in Oregon, and I hadn't taken a real break in months. I'd been meaning to clear my head and get away from the constant noise of the garage, so I packed up my old Ford Ranger one Friday morning and drove toward the Cascade Mountains. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just said I'd be gone for the weekend. I figured it would be nice to have no one know where I was for once. That thought felt peaceful at the time. I reached a quiet forest road by mid-afternoon, one of those narrow gravel stretches that looked barely used. The trees were thick and tall, the kind that made the sky vanish when you looked up. The air was cool and smelled like pine and dirt. I drove for about an hour before finding a clearing that looked good enough to set up camp. There was an old fire ring made of stones, a half-rotten log someone had dragged there to sit on, and a small stream just beyond the trees. It felt perfect, far enough from civilization that I couldn't hear any cars, only the rustling of wind and the occasional snap of a branch. I set up my small green tent near the stream, built a fire, and spent the evening roasting hot dogs and staring at the water. As the sun went down, everything around me grew darker than I expected. The forest absorbed the last bit of daylight until it felt like the only light left was from the fire. The sound of the stream blended with the occasional creaking of the trees. I didn't feel scared, just a strange sense of how isolated I really was. The silence out there had a weight to it, heavy and constant. I went to bed around 10, zipped up in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft crackle of the dying fire outside. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't because of a noise exactly, it was the lack of noise. The forest was completely silent. Even the water seemed quiet. My first thought was that maybe a larger animal was nearby, and everything else had gone still. I lay there, trying not to move, just listening. My tent was thin, and the darkness outside felt like it was pressing against it. After a few minutes, I heard it. A slow crunching sound, like footsteps on the dry needles outside. The steps were uneven, not the rhythm of an animal walking on four legs, but the uneven pattern of something walking upright. The sound moved slowly around my tent, and I could hear the faint brush of something against the nylon fabric. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, trying to stay completely still. The footsteps stopped right beside my tent. For several seconds, there was nothing, just the sound of my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then, the footsteps started again, fading away toward the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the small knife I kept in my backpack. When the light finally came through, I stepped out of the tent, my legs shaky. The ground around the tent was covered in pine needles, but I could see several footprints, human footprints. They were faint but clear enough to know someone had been walking in circles around my campsite. I looked toward the trees, expecting maybe to see another tent or signs of someone camping nearby, but there was nothing. No sounds, no smoke, nothing. I told myself it had to be a hiker passing through. Maybe they got lost and wandered too close. It didn't feel right, but I forced myself to believe it. I made breakfast, packed up some water, and decided to go for a hike up the ridge to get a better view of the area. The trail was overgrown, and the higher I went, the quieter it became again. A few 100 feet up, I found something that stopped me cold. A makeshift camp. It wasn't like mine. It was just a torn tarp tied between two trees, a few old food wrappers scattered around, and a pile of clothes that looked filthy and sun-faded. There were no bags, no gear, nothing that suggested someone was camping normally. I looked closer and saw a small notebook half buried under the leaves. The pages were damp and smudged, but I could make out some writing. It was mostly nonsense. Lists of dates, little sketches of trees and trails, and what looked like names written over and over again. The handwriting looked shaky. I didn't stay long. I felt exposed standing there like whoever made that camp could be watching. When I got back to my tent, I decided I'd leave that night instead of staying another day. I started gathering my things, but as the afternoon went on, I kept feeling watched. Every time the wind moved through the trees, I'd turn, expecting to see someone standing there. Couldn't shake it. Around sunset, I lit another fire, mostly to calm myself. The forest looked different now. The shadows felt longer. The trees seemed to crowd in closer. When night came, I stayed awake, sitting by the fire, my knife resting beside me. A few hours passed like that. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again, the same slow crunching footsteps. They came from the same direction as before, steady, deliberate. I froze and kept my eyes fixed on the dark beyond the firelight. The footsteps stopped again near the edge of the clearing. I could see nothing but trees. Then something moved, a faint shape just beyond the light, like a person standing there. I couldn't make out their face, just the outline of a body. They didn't move closer. They just stood there. I stayed completely still, my throat dry, waiting for them to do something. After what felt like forever, the figure stepped back into the darkness. The sound of footsteps faded again, and I didn't hear anything after that. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I packed up in minutes and threw everything into my truck. I didn't bother putting out the fire properly. I just drove. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, hours away from that place. When I got home, I checked online for any reports of missing hikers or strange activity in that area. I found nothing recent, but there were a few old posts from years before. People mentioning seeing a man wandering the forest alone, living off whatever he could find. Some said he'd been around since the early 2000s, avoiding towns, breaking into camps at night to steal food. No one ever caught him. It's been years since then, but I haven't gone camping alone again. Sometimes when I'm driving through wooded roads, I still think about that night. The sound of those slow footsteps circling my tent, the feeling of someone standing just outside, watching me breathe in the dark. I still wonder how close they came before I woke up. It was early October of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I had just turned 30 and wanted a break from the city noise. I picked a place near the edge of Ottawa National Forest, somewhere far from any campground or ranger station. I wanted quiet, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat when you stop moving. I packed everything I thought I'd need. My old tent, a sleeping bag that still smelled faintly of smoke from past trips, a small hatchet, food, and a simple first aid kit. I didn't plan to stay more than 2 nights. The drive took me close to 9 hours. The roads narrowed the deeper I went, the trees on both sides closing in so tightly that my headlights only lit a narrow tunnel ahead. When I finally turned off the main highway and followed a dirt road deeper into the woods, my cell signal dropped to nothing. I liked that part. No calls, no notifications, just me and the woods. I parked near a clearing that sloped down to a small lake. The water was calm, like glass, reflecting the gray clouds overhead. I set up my tent about 30 yards from the edge, on a small patch of soft earth surrounded by pine and birch. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp leaves and moss. The forest was completely still, except for a few distant crows and the occasional rustle of wind. The first day went fine. I made a small fire, ate some canned food, and sat near the water watching the sun dip behind the trees. I noticed there were no other campsites or signs of people anywhere near me. Not even footprints or fire rings. That part struck me as odd, but it made sense since I had driven far past the usual camping areas. By nightfall, the forest grew so dark that it felt like standing inside a closed room. The kind of darkness that makes your eyes strain for shapes that aren't there. I fell asleep around 10 p.m., the sound of crickets and frogs mixing into a soft background hum. I woke up once in the middle of the night because I thought I heard something moving outside. It sounded like dry leaves being crushed under slow, heavy steps. I held my breath and waited. The noise stopped. I told myself it was a raccoon or maybe a deer. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I noticed something odd in the soft dirt near my tent. Footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints, deep and uneven, like someone had been walking in circles. The prints led away toward the trees behind my tent, stopping abruptly a few feet in. I didn't see anyone. The forest was completely still. I brushed it off, telling myself maybe they were old, maybe from hunters or loggers. Still, it left me uneasy. That afternoon, I went hiking deeper into the woods, following an old overgrown path that wound between tall pines. The forest had that muffled quiet that happens when the wind stops completely. I found what looked like a hunting blind made of rotting wood and branches, half collapsed and empty. Inside it were a few old cans, a torn blanket, and a rusted knife stuck into the dirt. Everything looked like it had been left there years ago. When I got back to my camp around evening, I noticed something else. My hatchet, which I'd left stuck in a log by the fire, was missing. I stood there for a long time staring at the empty log. I checked around the tent, near the fire, by the water, nothing. The hatchet was gone. My gut told me someone had been there while I was gone. I decided to keep the fire going later that night, just for comfort. The light helped, but when I crawled into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the dark beyond the treeline. Every time the fire crackled, it made me flinch. Around midnight, I woke up again to movement. This time, it wasn't soft or distant. It was close, a few feet outside my tent. I could hear slow steps moving around, the crunch of twigs and leaves, a pause, then more steps. I froze, barely breathing. My heart thudded so hard it made my sleeping bag shake. Then I heard something metallic, a faint clink, like metal tapping against metal. The sound of a blade, maybe. I reached slowly for the flashlight near my sleeping bag but didn't turn it on. The footsteps circled once around the tent, then stopped completely. I waited. Minutes passed. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I must have drifted off out of pure exhaustion. When morning came, I stepped outside carefully. The ground around my tent was covered in fresh prints, boot prints again. I could clearly see where someone had walked close to the tent, stopped near the flap, then walked back toward the woods. My missing hatchet was lying near the edge of the trees, half buried in mud. I picked it up, but the handle was damp and sticky, like it had been held for a long time. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything quickly and loaded my gear into the car. When I turned the ignition, the engine wouldn't start. It clicked weakly but wouldn't catch. I tried again and again. Nothing. I popped the hood but couldn't figure out what was wrong. I wasn't a mechanic. The nearest town was miles away. No signal. No help. By noon, I was sweating from frustration and fear. I decided to walk until I found a main road or another camper. I took only my backpack, a flashlight, some food, and my hatchet. I marked trees as I went, in case I needed to find my way back. After maybe an hour of walking, I noticed something that froze me. A piece of bright orange fabric tied to a tree ahead. My tent's rain cover. I hadn't left it there. That's when I realized I was walking in circles. My marks were on the same trees I'd passed earlier, even though I was sure I'd been moving straight. I don't know if I misjudged the direction or if someone had been following and leading me off track. I felt watched again, the same uneasy prickle on my neck. I decided to go back to the car. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping low, the light turning gold between the trees. My car door was open. I knew I had locked it. Inside, everything was ransacked. My bag torn open, my food gone, even the first aid kit scattered across the seat. I didn't see anyone around. The woods were silent again, that thick, unnatural silence that feels like a held breath. I grabbed the hatchet and stood there, not sure what to do. I thought about staying in the car until morning, but the thought of sitting there in the dark while someone could be nearby made my stomach twist. As the light faded, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees across the clearing. It was quick, just a shadow of a person stepping behind a trunk. I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and ran. I ran through the woods, branches slapping my arms, leaves crunching under my boots. I didn't stop until I saw faint light through the trees, the reflection of headlights from a dirt road. A pickup truck came down the road not long after. I waved it down, breathless and shaking. The man inside drove me to a small ranger station about 10 miles away. When they went back to check my camp the next day, my car was gone. They found only the flattened grass where it had been parked and some prints leading into the forest that disappeared after 100 feet. No one ever found the car. I still think about that night. The sound of those slow steps circling my tent, the missing hatchet, the boot prints that appeared and vanished. The forest out there feels endless, and somewhere inside it, someone had been watching me. Whoever it was didn't want me to leave. I don't know why they didn't finish whatever they started, but I know one thing for sure. If my car had started that morning, I never would have walked away from that place. I went camping alone in the late summer of 2014, somewhere deep in the northern part of Idaho. I was 26 then, working at a tire shop, living a quiet life, and I had a few days off that I didn't want to waste sitting in my apartment. I'd been wanting to test myself, to go somewhere isolated, somewhere I couldn't just walk back to my car and drive to a hotel if things got uncomfortable. I picked a remote area near Priest Lake, about an hour from the nearest small town. I had a rough map printed from an online forum where other hikers talked about a hidden trail leading to an old, unused logging site that had a clearing perfect for camping. It wasn't an official campsite, that's what drew me to it. I parked my old Toyota pickup near the dirt access road around mid-morning and started hiking in with my backpack and small tent. The trail was narrow, overgrown in some parts, and it took me about 3 hours of walking through tall pines and uneven ground before I found the clearing. It wasn't big, just a rough patch of flat ground surrounded by trees that looked almost black against the bright sky. A few old pieces of rusted metal and chunks of wood were scattered around, leftovers from when logging equipment had been left behind decades ago. I set up my tent close to the edge of the trees, near a large boulder where I could lean and sit comfortably. There was a creek about 50 feet down a small slope, its water cold and fast. It was quiet except for the sound of insects and the steady hum of the forest. For the first few hours, everything felt fine, peaceful even. I walked around, gathered some dry wood, and made a small fire before dusk. But once the sun started dropping behind the trees, that calm feeling changed. The air felt heavier. The forest got darker faster than I expected, and I realized how far I really was from anyone. I couldn't see the dirt road from here, and even if I shouted, nobody would hear me. I remember sitting by the fire and noticing how the sounds around me shifted. The birds had gone quiet, replaced by the distant snapping of branches that came and went. I kept trying to convince myself it was just animals. Deer maybe, moving through the brush. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept my flashlight beside me. The temperature dropped a lot after dark. I lay there, staring at the fabric walls of the tent, listening. Every small sound outside was sharp. A crunch, a rustle, something brushing through the dry grass. At one point, there was a sound like someone stepping on gravel. Slow, heavy, spaced out. My whole body went tense. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. Then nothing. Just silence and my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Eventually I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up again around 3 in the morning. The fire had gone out, and the air inside the tent was freezing. I sat up, listening again, and that's when I smelled something faint. Not smoke, but something metallic, like rust or old blood. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make me alert. I thought maybe it was just the old metal from the logging scrap, but the smell seemed closer, drifting in through the small open vent at the top of the tent. I tried to ignore it and went back to sleep, But a little while later, I heard something again, a dragging sound, like something being pulled slowly through the dirt. It was faint but close enough that I could feel it through the ground. My stomach felt tight, and I stayed completely still. I didn't even move my flashlight at first. Then, after a few seconds of silence, I heard a soft thump, like something had dropped just a few feet from my tent. I waited, I don't know for how long, maybe a few minutes. When I finally got enough nerve, I unzipped the tent a few inches and pointed my flashlight outside. The beam caught the side of the boulder, part of the trees, and my small fire pit. Nothing was there. No animal, no person. Just my supplies and the quiet woods. I sat there, half inside the tent, flashlight shaking a bit in my hand, waiting for movement. Nothing. I zipped the tent back up and sat awake until the sky started turning gray. In the morning, I walked around the camp to check. I expected to see maybe a deer track or a sign of some animal, but I found something else. About 10 feet from the tent, near the fire pit, there were 2 long drag marks in the dirt. Not deep, but clear. They led from the edge of the trees toward the creek, stopping at the slope. The dirt was disturbed, as if something heavy had been pulled through. I followed them a bit, but they disappeared once they reached the wet ground near the water. I stood there staring for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I didn't want to think it was a person, but the marks looked too deliberate. I decided to pack up. I told myself it wasn't fear, that I was just being smart, but I knew I was scared. The woods felt different in the daylight, but not safer. The silence was worse now, as if everything was watching. It took me longer to hike back than before. My backpack felt heavier, my throat dry. The trail was the same, but I kept turning around, feeling like someone was behind me. Once, when I stopped to rest, I saw something about 50 yards off the trail. Something that looked like a tarp or fabric stuck on a fallen branch. I thought about checking, but I didn't. I just kept walking until I finally reached the spot where my truck was parked. When I got there, something felt off again. The driver's side door was open. I was sure I'd closed it before heading out. I froze, scanning the trees. There wasn't a sound. The inside of the truck looked untouched. My keys were still on the seat, and nothing seemed stolen. But on the inside of the door, smeared across the metal near the handle, was a streak of dark, dried dirt, almost like someone with muddy hands had touched it. I wiped it off quickly, got in, and started the engine. The sound of the motor was almost a relief. As I drove away down that narrow dirt road, I didn't look in the mirrors much. I just wanted to get out. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the highway. I sat there for a while, looking at the dirt on my hands, trying to calm down. I never told anyone about it. I didn't report it or ask about the area. But a few weeks later, I read online that a hunter had found an old sleeping bag and pieces of torn fabric near that same section of forest, not far from the creek. They thought it might have belonged to a missing person from years back. I still don't know what I heard that night, whether it was an animal, a person, or just my mind working against me. But I know what I saw the next morning was real. The drag marks, the smell, the open truck door. Something or someone had been close enough to touch where I slept. I haven't gone camping alone since. Every time I think about doing it, I remember that sound, that slow dragging through the dirt, and I see that clearing again in my head. Just trees, silence, and the feeling that something was watching from the dark, waiting for me to fall asleep again. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I was 29 at the time, working a dull warehouse job that left me drained but restless. I'd been meaning to get away for a while, somewhere far from noise, from people, from everything that reminded me of that mechanical routine. I'd camped alone before, but never this deep in the woods. That was the point, though. I wanted silence, complete, unbroken silence, and the kind of solitude that made your head clear. I left my car parked off an old Forest Service road, miles from the nearest town. The path was narrow and muddy, the trees pressed close together, their branches heavy with orange and brown leaves. It was late afternoon when I reached the spot I had marked on my phone. a small clearing beside a creek that curved between mossy rocks. The ground was soft with pine needles, and I could hear nothing but water trickling and wind moving through the trees. I set up my small green tent, unpacked my sleeping bag, stove, and gear, then gathered some dry wood for the fire. The air was cold enough to bite my fingers, and every exhale came out white. That first night, everything felt right. The fire burned steady, and I sat near it for hours just staring into it, feeling my mind slow down. There was something hypnotic about the crackling and the way the orange light moved on the trees around me. I ate a can of beans, wrote a few lines in my notebook, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. I could hear the faint sound of the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl far away. It took a while to fall asleep, but when I did, I slept deeply. The next morning, I woke up to frost on the tent. The forest looked pale and still, every branch glazed in white. I made coffee, warmed my hands on the metal mug, and decided to follow the creek upstream for a bit. It wound between slopes covered in thick ferns and fallen logs. After about an hour, I found the remains of what looked like an old campsite, a rusted cooking grate, a few broken bottles, and a small fire ring half buried in leaves. Everything was overgrown, like it hadn't been touched in years. I didn't think much of it at first. The forest was huge, and people had probably camped here decades ago. But as I moved closer, I noticed a pile of clothes nearby. Shredded jeans, a torn flannel, and a single boot. They looked like they'd been there a long time. I remember standing there for a while, unsure what to do. They weren't fresh, but it still felt wrong to just leave them. I took a few photos with my phone and made a mental note of the location in case I needed to report it. When I got back to camp, I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself it was nothing, maybe a hunter or just some old junk. Still, I couldn't stop glancing into the trees while I cooked dinner that evening. Every time the wind moved the branches, I thought I saw someone standing behind them. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I kept hearing sounds, not loud ones, but subtle, deliberate ones. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. It wasn't the quick movement of an animal. It was slower, heavier, like footsteps. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the side of my tent. My heart started pounding, but when I looked, there was nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. The forest looked empty, but the fire had gone out, and the darkness between the trees felt endless. I stayed awake until dawn, every small noise making my chest tighten. When daylight came, I walked the area around camp. There were faint depressions in the ground, like someone had stepped there. Not clear footprints, but enough to notice. I told myself it could have been deer or even my own tracks from the day before, but it didn't feel right. I packed up my food and gear tighter that day, just in case. I wanted to finish out the trip, but part of me was already thinking about heading back early. By the third night, the air had grown colder and the forest quieter. I built a larger fire that time, trying to make myself feel safer. I sat with my flashlight beside me, my knife within reach. I didn't even try to sleep early. I just stared into the dark, listening. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it again, the slow, dragging sound of something moving through leaves. I turned the flashlight toward it and caught a glimpse of movement behind a tree, a dark shape that ducked away the second the light touched it. I froze. My mouth went dry. I waited, but nothing else moved. The forest was completely still again. That was it for me. I decided I wasn't spending another night there. I kept the fire burning until morning, my eyes barely blinking, my mind running wild. As soon as the sun came up, I packed everything up in minutes. I didn't even bother to eat breakfast. The trail back to the car felt twice as long. Every sound behind me made me whip around. The trees seemed tighter, closer, like the forest itself didn't want me leaving. I could swear I heard footsteps behind me several times, faint but matching my pace, stopping when I stopped. When I finally reached the car, I threw everything inside, locked the doors, and sat there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I stayed like that for a few minutes, just staring into the mirror at the path I had come from. That's when I saw it. Someone standing at the edge of the trees, Far enough that I couldn't make out details, but close enough to see the shape of a person. Still motionless, watching. I didn't even think. I started the car, threw it in reverse, and tore down that dirt road as fast as I could, not looking back again. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station in a small town almost an hour away. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I thought I saw. Maybe it was just another camper. Maybe someone had been living out there. But that didn't explain why they waited in the dark, why they never said anything, or why they stood there watching me leave. A week later, I called the local ranger station to report the old campsite and the clothes I found. The ranger on the phone sounded calm but told me they'd check it out. A few days after that, I got a call back. They said they couldn't find any trace of the clothes or the fire ring. I even sent them the photos I'd taken, but they said the coordinates led to a spot that didn't match the pictures, like it was somewhere else entirely. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I drive past the tree lines outside of town. I can't explain everything I saw out there. All I know is that someone was in those woods with me. Quiet, patient, and close enough to reach me if they wanted to. And maybe that's what scares me the most, not knowing what they wanted or why they let me go. I went camping alone in the summer of 2018, deep in the northern part of Montana, near the edge of the Kootenai National Forest. I was 26 at the time, still trying to clear my head after quitting a job that had drained me for years. I picked a remote area after scrolling through satellite maps online. A small clearing by a river bend surrounded by dense pine forest. There were no official campgrounds nearby, no trails that went all the way there. I wanted peace, quiet, and space to think. I parked my car on a narrow dirt road about 2 miles away from where I planned to camp and hiked in with all my gear. It took me about an hour and a half to reach the spot. The air was dry and sharp, smelling like pine and dust. The sound of the river carried through the trees, faint but steady. I set up my tent near a big flat rock that faced the water. The river itself wasn't wide, maybe 10 feet across, but it ran fast and clear over dark stones. The sun was still high when I finished setting up my camp. Tent, small fire pit, and a rope strung between 2 trees for drying clothes. I spent most of that first day just walking along the riverbank, getting used to the quiet. The only noises were the rushing water, the wind in the trees, and the occasional chirp of a bird somewhere far off. It felt good at first, being that far away from everything. When night came, I built a small fire, cooked some food, and sat watching the trees across the river fade into darkness. There was no phone signal, no lights anywhere, just black forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The first night passed without much happening. I woke up a few times to faint rustling sounds outside my tent, but I brushed it off as animals, maybe a raccoon or deer moving through the brush. The forest was full of life, and I had read enough to know that little noises were normal out here. The second day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest, heading west along the river. I followed it for about 3 hours until I came across an old wooden bridge. It was barely standing, the wood blackened and cracked with age. Some of the planks were missing, and the whole thing leaned slightly to one side. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years. The trail that led to it was overgrown, and there were no signs or markers. I didn't cross the bridge. I just stood there, staring at it. The sight of it gave me an odd feeling, like I was standing in a place that time had forgotten. I walked a bit further downriver, found a clearing where the ground was soft with pine needles, and sat there eating a snack before turning back. That evening, as I was cooking by the fire, I noticed something strange. Across the river, maybe 30 or 40 yards away, there was a faint flash of light. It was quick, like the reflection of something metallic catching the sunset. I thought maybe it was water glinting off a rock, but the more I looked, the more I was sure it wasn't that. It happened again just for a second, a flicker of movement and light between the trees. I stood up and stared into the darkening woods for a long time, waiting for it to happen again. Didn't. When the night came fully, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just a trick of the light. But it bothered me enough that I packed up my food and stored it away properly, making sure not to leave anything out that could attract animals. That night I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing small snapping sounds, like twigs breaking under weight, but they were far away, not close enough to be a threat. At one point, I thought I heard something splash in the river. I froze, listening, holding my breath. The forest went completely silent for a while. No wind, no water, just dead stillness. I lay there with my heart pounding until I finally drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I went to the river to wash my face, and I noticed something odd near the opposite bank. There were footprints in the mud. Not animal prints, these were human. They led from the tree line down to the water and then disappeared. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They weren't my prints. They were too far across. Someone had been there. I decided not to panic. Maybe it was just another camper somewhere nearby, though I hadn't seen or heard anyone in days. I didn't see any tents, no smoke from fires, no gear or paths. Still, I tried to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. I spent the rest of the day trying to enjoy my time, fishing a bit and writing in my notebook. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That night, I built a larger fire and sat close to it, keeping my flashlight and knife near me. I told myself it was silly, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing across the river every few minutes, scanning the dark tree line. Around midnight, I thought I saw movement again, something tall and thin shifting between the trees. My eyes locked on it, and for a moment I was sure I saw a person standing there. But when I shined my light that way, there was nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound felt like it was coming closer. The faint rustle of leaves, the crunch of soil underfoot, the soft splash of water. I sat in my tent, wide awake, gripping my flashlight, waiting for something that never came. When dawn finally broke, I walked to the river again. The footprints were gone, washed away or covered in fresh mud. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to pack up and hike back to my car. I started doing that right away, moving fast, barely stopping to eat. I had this deep instinct that I shouldn't stay another night. As I was packing, I found something that froze me. On the ground near my tent, under the rope where I'd hung my clothes, there was a cigarette butt. I don't smoke. It hadn't been there before. It was still fresh, not even fully dry. Someone had been near my tent while I slept. I tore down everything as fast as I could and started hiking out. The forest felt heavier, the silence thicker. Every few minutes I thought I heard something behind me, like soft footsteps trying to match mine. I didn't look back. I just kept going until I saw my car through the trees. When I got there, I noticed that the driver's side door wasn't fully closed. I always double-checked that. The inside of the car smelled faintly of sweat and something else, like damp wood or old smoke. Nothing was missing, but the glove box was open, and the map I had left on the passenger seat was gone. I drove out of there fast, not stopping until I reached the main highway hours later. I stayed at a motel that night, too tired and shaken to even think straight. A week later, when I went through my camera, I found something that made my stomach turn. There were photos I hadn't taken, blurry shots of my campsite from the opposite side of the river. They were dark, probably taken at night. In one of them, you could see the faint glow of my campfire. In another, my tent was half lit by the moon. And in one more, I was sitting by the fire with my back to the camera. Whoever had been out there wasn't passing through. They had been watching me. I've never gone camping alone again after that. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in the southern part of Oregon. I was 27, had just gone through a rough breakup, and needed to get away from people for a while. I packed my old truck with a tent, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, and my small cooler with water bottles and beer. I picked a forest area I had never been to before, just somewhere random I saw on a topographic map. It was about 2 hours off the main highway, way out near some old logging roads that hadn't been used much in years. I remember the air feeling cool that morning, and the clouds hanging low over the distant mountains. It felt peaceful, in that lonely kind of way. The drive was long, quiet, and the deeper I went, the rougher the roads got. By the time I reached the spot I'd picked, it was already late afternoon. There were no other cars, No sign of anyone. The only sound was the occasional bird and the wind moving through the tall, dark pines. I parked near a small clearing that had an old fire ring made of blackened stones. I set up my tent about 20 feet from the truck, close enough to feel safe but far enough that I could stretch out and have space for a small fire later. Once camp was set, I walked around for a while, exploring the area. The forest had that deep quiet that only really old woods have. The trees were thick, the ground covered with wet needles and patches of moss. I found a narrow trail behind the clearing that looked like it might have been used by hunters, or maybe old loggers a long time ago. It led downhill toward a shallow stream that wound between rocks and thick brush. The water was cold and clear. I filled one of my bottles and sat there for a while, listening to nothing but the sound of it moving. I remember thinking how good it felt to be completely alone. When I got back to camp, the light was fading. I made a small fire, opened a can of beans, and sat there eating while watching the trees turn dark. I could see the faint glow of my truck's metal frame catching the firelight. Everything felt normal. I remember that clearly. Normal. I stayed up maybe another hour after sunset, just staring at the fire until it burned down to red coals, and then crawled into my tent. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. It was dead quiet outside. No wind, no crickets, no movement at all. I checked my watch, it was just after 2 in the morning. I lay there for a while, staring up at the fabric of the tent, feeling a strange pressure in my chest. It wasn't fear, not yet, just that uneasy awareness that something had changed. I shifted a little, listening harder, and then I heard it. A single crunch, faint, somewhere outside near the truck. Could have been anything. A branch falling, an animal stepping on something, but it sounded heavy. Too heavy for something small like a raccoon or fox. I held my breath, listening. Another slow crunch, then another. It was coming from the direction of the clearing, moving in the dry needles. I stayed frozen for what felt like a full minute. Then, very quietly, I unzipped the sleeping bag and sat up. I didn't want to make any noise. My flashlight was on the floor of the tent near my boots. I reached for it but stopped myself before turning it on. My truck was locked, but everything else, my cooler, my food, was outside. I thought maybe a bear had come through. The sound stopped. Total silence again. Then, a soft dragging noise, like something being pulled slowly across the ground. My mouth went dry instantly. Sounded close. Too close. I thought of my cooler, thinking maybe something had grabbed it. I waited, trying to figure out what to do. If it was a bear, yelling might scare it, but I didn't want to risk it getting aggressive. So I just stayed still. After a few more seconds, I heard something scrape against metal. My stomach dropped. It was my truck. The sound was faint but clear, like a hand or claw brushing along the door. My pulse started pounding in my ears. I didn't even breathe. Then there was a sharp click sound, like a handle being tested. My truck door handle. That's when I knew it wasn't an animal. I froze in place, feeling my heart thudding so hard I thought whoever it was could hear it. I waited, listening for another sound. Nothing. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a slow step, just one moving toward the tent. The fabric seemed thinner all of a sudden, like it couldn't stop anything from getting in. I gripped my flashlight and my small camping knife, the only thing close enough to grab. The steps stopped, then silence again, but now I could hear faint breathing, someone exhaling, slow, right outside. I didn't move for at least 2 minutes. Then I heard the sound of leaves brushing as they moved away, slowly, carefully, like they didn't want me to know they were leaving. I sat there, muscles locked, waiting. I don't remember how long I stayed awake, but I know I didn't sleep again that night. When the first light of morning came through the tent fabric, I finally unzipped the flap and stepped out. Everything looked exactly the same as before, except my cooler had been dragged a few feet away and the lid was open. My truck had a small smudge near the handle, like a greasy fingerprint. I checked all around camp, scanning for tracks, but the ground was too hard to tell much. There were just faint marks near the edge of the clearing. I packed everything up fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. The woods felt different now, like they were watching. I threw my gear in the truck and started down the rough dirt road, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the whole way. About a mile down, I saw something strange on the right side of the road. It was a single black glove lying in the dirt, old and stiff like it had been rained on a few times. I stopped for half a second, then just kept driving. My rearview mirror showed nothing but trees fading behind me, but I swear, for miles after, I kept feeling like someone was standing back there, just out of sight, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, and when I did, I finally felt that tightness in my chest ease up a little. I pulled over, sat there, and tried to process what had just happened. Maybe it was someone living off the grid, maybe someone hiding something in those woods. I'll never know, but I do know this. I've gone camping hundreds of times since I was a kid, in all kinds of places, and I've never once felt anything like that night. That feeling of knowing someone was there, close enough to touch my truck, close enough to stand over my tent in the dark, that doesn't go away. When I got home, I washed the truck and put everything away, but I couldn't bring myself to clean the tent. The smell of pine and smoke was still in it, mixed with something else, something faintly metallic like old sweat or dirt. I ended up throwing it out. I haven't camped alone since. Every time I drive past the edge of a forest now, I look at the tree line and think about that night, about the sound of slow steps on dry needles, about that single breath outside the thin fabric wall. It's the kind of thing you can't unhear once you've heard it. And no matter how much time passes, I still sometimes wake up in the dark, certain that someone's standing just outside again, waiting for me to listen. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to spend a long weekend camping alone, deep in the woods near Mount Sterling, Kentucky. I had been working long shifts at a warehouse for months, barely seeing daylight, and I needed some time away from everything. I wasn't new to camping, but I had never gone this deep into the forest before. I picked a spot I found online, an old logging trail that cut through miles of quiet woods, far away from the usual campsites. I liked the idea of being completely alone. I left early Friday morning with my small tent, a sleeping bag, some cans of food, a water filter, and my old hunting knife. I parked my car off a narrow gravel road, where the trees thickened on both sides, and started hiking in. The trail was overgrown but visible, covered with fallen leaves, damp from the rain the day before. The forest was heavy with that earthy smell, wet wood, pine, and rot. I hiked for about 2 hours before I found a flat clearing that looked perfect. There was a small stream nearby, a cluster of rocks that could be used for sitting, and enough trees for shade but open sky above for light. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, got the fire pit ready, and spent most of the afternoon collecting wood. The silence out there was something else. No cars, no people, no faint sound of planes. Just insects, birds, and the occasional cracking branch in the distance. It was peaceful, but the kind of peace that also feels heavy, like the woods are always watching. As the sun went down, I started a small fire and ate a can of beans with bread. I sat there for a long time, just watching the fire die down, listening to the steady rush of the stream. The night came fast, and it got cold. The darkness in those woods was thick, almost solid. My flashlight beam didn't travel far before it was swallowed by blackness. I sat by the fire until my eyes got tired, then crawled into my tent. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The air inside the tent felt still, and my breath made faint clouds in the cold. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound from the direction of the stream. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like someone moving through wet leaves. I lay still, listening, thinking maybe it was just an animal, but the sound didn't move away. It stopped for a few seconds, then started again, a slow dragging noise mixed with the occasional crack of a stick. I felt my heartbeat in my chest. I reached quietly for the flashlight beside me and turned it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. The sound was closer now, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. Then it stopped completely. I waited, holding my breath, but after a while, there was only the sound of water. I stayed awake for almost an hour before I finally fell asleep again. The next morning, the ground was damp, and fog hung low across the trees. I went to check near the stream. The soil there was soft and dark, and I could see faint impressions in the mud. Not boots, but something like bare feet. They weren't small either. The prints were uneven and deep, like someone had been walking slowly, dragging one foot. It looked strange, but I told myself it could have been erosion or maybe someone had come through earlier that week. Still, it made me uneasy. I spent most of that day hiking around, trying to shake the thought. I found an old hunting blind about half a mile away, almost collapsed under vines and moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were beer cans inside, old and rusted, and some shredded fabric that looked like part of a sleeping bag. I didn't stay long. Something about the silence there made me want to leave fast. Back at camp, I built another fire and cooked a small meal. As the sun went down, I noticed how quiet it was again. Quieter than before. The birds stopped earlier than usual, and the air felt still and heavy. That night, when I crawled back into the tent, I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my stomach. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't from a sound at first, but from a smell. Something sour, like rotting meat mixed with mud. My stomach turned. Then I heard the same dragging sound again, this time closer, just outside the tent. The crunch of wet leaves was slow, deliberate. It circled around my tent once, then stopped behind it. I held the knife in my hand and waited. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The smell got stronger, like something dead was right outside. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. I stayed awake the rest of the night, shaking, listening to every small noise the forest made. When daylight finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The first thing I saw was a small pile of rocks near the edge of the clearing. They hadn't been there before. They were stacked carefully, about knee-high. On top of them was a small animal skull, a raccoon maybe. It was clean, too clean. I stared at it for a long time, my hands trembling slightly. I packed up right then. I didn't even finish breakfast. I just threw everything into my bag and started heading back toward the car. The woods looked different in daylight, brighter but still empty, as if they were hiding something between the trees. I kept thinking I was hearing footsteps behind me, faint but matching my pace, stopping when I stopped. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the car, the relief that hit me made my knees weak. I tossed the gear in the trunk, started the engine, and drove off that gravel road as fast as I could. A week later, I was still thinking about those prints, that smell, the rocks, and the skull. It didn't make sense, but part of me wanted to know if anyone else had camped there before. I checked an old hiking forum where people talked about spots around Mount Sterling. Someone had posted about that same logging trail a few years earlier. They said they found signs of an old squatter camp deeper in the woods. Clothes, bones, and makeshift traps. No one knew if the person was still out there or if they'd ever left. I never went back to find out. Even now, I still remember the smell and the feeling of being watched from the dark. The woods didn't need monsters or ghosts to be terrifying. Sometimes, the scariest thing is realizing you were never as alone as you thought you were. It was the middle of August 2014 when I decided to go camping alone for a few days in northern Montana. I was 29, working a dull warehouse job, and I'd been feeling like I needed to get away from people for a bit. I drove my old blue Tacoma up past the small town of Libby, then followed a dirt road that twisted through miles of thick pine forest until it ended at a small clearing near a creek. The air smelled clean and sharp, the kind of air that made you feel like your lungs were finally getting used after sitting too long in a city. There wasn't another person or car in sight. I parked near the tree line and set up my tent about 30 yards from the creek. The grass was damp but not muddy. The sound of running water was steady, like a low whisper under the trees. After setting everything up, I made a small fire, cooked a can of chili, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. I remember feeling completely calm that first evening. There's something about being that far from anyone else that makes your mind slow down. You start hearing every little sound, the faint creak of branches, the quick rustle of a squirrel, the snap of a stick far off, and your brain slowly learns which ones are harmless. The first night passed quietly. I woke up a couple times because of the cold and had to crawl deeper into my sleeping bag. But that was it. The second day, I spent walking along the creek. It curved around a bend about half a mile from my camp, and beyond that was an old logging road that had been swallowed up by moss and weeds. I followed it until it faded into the forest. I saw deer tracks in the mud, old beer cans half buried near a fallen tree, and what looked like a torn piece of flannel cloth hanging from a branch, probably from a hunter or hiker. Nothing strange. That evening, though, the woods started to feel different. Maybe it was because of how still it got around sunset. The wind died, and even the creek sounded quieter. I remember noticing how dense the trees looked once the light started fading. Everything had that deep blue shade that comes before total darkness, and it was like the forest swallowed up distance. Things 10 feet away felt like they were 50. I made my fire again, ate some jerky and beans, and stayed up a while just watching the flames. It must have been close to midnight when I woke up. The fire was out except for a few glowing embers, and I could hear something moving outside the tent. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, somewhere near the creek. The sound was steady, slow. It wasn't a quick scuffle like a rabbit or a raccoon. It was heavier. I lay still and listened, trying to make sense of it. It moved for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. The night was dead silent after that. I stayed awake for a long time, straining to hear anything else, but eventually I dozed off again. When I woke up in the morning, I checked around camp. There were a few spots in the dirt where the grass looked flattened, but I told myself it could have been deer. I tried not to overthink it. Later that day, I walked upstream to where the creek split around a pile of rocks. The air felt colder there, and I remember seeing something white tangled in the branches across the water. When I got closer, I realized it was a shirt. It was torn up, stained with mud and something dark that looked old. I stood there a while, just looking at it, trying to figure out how it got there. It didn't look like it had been washed down by the current. It looked like it had been wedged between the branches. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept feeling like I was being watched. I'd look into the dark tree line, trying to see any movement, but there was nothing. The firelight only reached a few feet before it turned into blackness. Around 1 in the morning, I heard that same heavy movement again. This time, closer. My heart started pounding hard. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I couldn't see anything at first, just the faint glow from the dying fire. But then I caught a glimpse of something pale between the trees. It looked like the back of a person's shoulder, but they were standing too still. I froze. The figure didn't move. I waited, watching, until my eyes started watering from not blinking. Then it turned slightly, like it was listening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I don't know how long I stayed like that, staring, but eventually I backed away from the flap and grabbed my flashlight. When I shined it outside, the spot was empty. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear a crack or a snap somewhere in the woods. By morning, I was exhausted. I decided I'd pack up and leave that afternoon, but part of me felt stupid. I told myself it was probably a hunter or some guy camping nearby. Still, when I walked down to the creek to wash my face, I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the opposite bank, there were fresh footprints, bare, human ones. The mud was soft and dark, and you could see every toe. They led from the trees to the edge of the water, then disappeared into the shallows. That was it for me. I packed everything up as fast as I could. When I went to load my cooler into the truck bed, I noticed the lid was open. The latch was bent. A few food wrappers were scattered nearby. Maybe it had been an animal, but the weird thing was the way the cooler was opened. It wasn't torn apart, just pried open carefully, like someone used their hands. I started driving back down the dirt road, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror the whole time. The trees looked endless. After maybe 15 minutes, I saw something through the side mirror that made my blood run cold. A shape stepping out onto the road behind me. It was too far to make out clearly, but I could see the color of skin, bare and pale. It didn't chase me, just stood there watching as I sped off. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. I remember pulling over near a gas station and just sitting there for a long time, trying to process what I saw. I never reported it because I couldn't even describe what I'd actually seen. Could have been some lost person, maybe someone living out there. but every part of me knew that whoever it was had been watching me from the woods for days. A few weeks later, I read a small article online about a missing hiker in that same area. They found his car near one of the forest access roads but never found him. The search teams reported seeing strange makeshift camps deep in the forest, with remains of animals and old camping gear scattered around. I didn't finish reading the rest. Even now, years later, whenever I'm driving through a wooded area at night, I can't help but glance into the trees. I think about that shape standing still between the trunks, listening, watching. I never went camping alone again, and I never will. I went camping alone in the fall of 2017, deep in the forests of northern Montana. I was 28 back then, still working as a mechanic, and I had taken a week off because I was tired of the noise of the city. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be surrounded by trees and wind and nothing else. I picked a spot near an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. You could barely even see the tire tracks anymore, just faint grooves buried under pine needles and dead leaves. The first day was fine. The air was crisp, and the woods felt empty in that peaceful kind of way. I set up my tent near a creek, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the water. The sound of the running water made everything feel calm. I cooked a small meal on my little propane stove and spent most of the evening collecting firewood and clearing the ground around my camp so I wouldn't trip during the night. When it got dark, it got really dark. There was no light pollution, not even a distant glow from a town or highway. The stars were sharp and cold-looking, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. I remember sitting there for a while, just watching my fire crackle. Everything felt fine until sometime past midnight when I heard movement out in the woods. It wasn't close at first, just the occasional crunch of something stepping on dry leaves. I assumed it was an elk or maybe a deer. They're everywhere in that part of Montana. But the sound kept circling. That's what started to bother me. It wasn't moving in one direction. It sounded like something walking slowly, stopping, then starting again a few seconds later. I didn't shine my light out there because I didn't want to attract attention. I just sat there and listened. After maybe 10 minutes, the sound faded. I told myself it was nothing, probably just some animal sniffing around. The next morning, I found footprints around my camp. At first glance, I thought they were mine, but when I crouched down, I saw they were too big and too wide. They were boot prints, not animal tracks. Someone had been there. The pattern looked fresh, and the soil was still damp where the heel had pressed in. I couldn't tell how many there were, maybe one person, maybe two. I felt uneasy, but I tried to stay calm. It wasn't illegal for people to hike out here, even if it was rare. Maybe it was a hunter or someone passing through. I packed up my things and went further up the creek that day, deeper into the woods. I figured putting some distance between me and whoever had come near my tent was a good idea. I hiked for a few hours, found another clearing a few hundred yards off the creek, and set up again. I built a smaller fire this time and tried to keep things quieter. The air felt heavier that evening, like the forest itself was watching me. Every sound carried far, the snapping of branches, the croak of frogs near the water, the distant rustle of wind in the trees. That night, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping right outside the tent. I froze. I could hear slow, careful footsteps. It wasn't the random movement of an animal. It was steady and deliberate. I didn't move, didn't even breathe loudly. I could see the faint shadow of movement against the thin fabric of the tent. The person, or whatever it was, stood there for a long time. I could see the silhouette of boots near the edge of the tent. Then, without warning, they moved away. I stayed still for another hour before I dared to unzip the tent and look outside. The fire had burned down to a few glowing coals. The woods were quiet again. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a piece of thin fishing line stretched between two trees, right about knee height, near the edge of my camp. Someone had set it up while I was asleep. I checked around and found another one a few feet away. This one tied between two branches at about chest level. It wasn't something random. Someone had deliberately set traps to make me trip or maybe to catch my attention. I couldn't imagine why. I wasn't near any private land, and there were no signs of other camps nearby. I packed up fast and started heading back toward the road. I didn't care if I had to hike all day. The woods felt wrong now, too silent, too still. Every time the wind moved through the branches, I jumped. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. I found more footprints along the creek as I moved downstream, and they matched the ones from the first campsite. Whoever it was, they'd been watching me for at least 2 days. Around midday, I noticed something strange in the mud near the water. It was a small pile of cigarette butts, maybe 5 or 6, half buried. I don't smoke. They were fresh, maybe from that morning. Whoever was out there was staying close. I started walking faster, not even taking breaks. The forest felt endless. Late in the afternoon, I saw movement up ahead through the trees. It was a flash of something dark, maybe clothing. I dropped to a crouch and stayed still. After a moment, I saw it again. Someone standing between 2 trees, just far enough that I couldn't see their face. They were tall, wearing a dark jacket and a cap. I didn't move. Neither did they. We stayed like that for what felt like minutes. Then they slowly stepped backward and disappeared into the trees. I ran. I didn't think, didn't stop, just ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were tearing apart. I didn't even follow the creek anymore. I just pushed through the forest in the direction I thought the road was. The woods started to thin after what felt like hours. I could see patches of sky again, and then I hit the edge of the old logging road. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my backpack twice before managing to pick it up again. I followed that road until I finally saw my truck. The sun was setting, and everything looked tinted orange and quiet. I don't think I've ever felt so relieved in my life. When I got in, I locked the doors immediately and sat there for a while, just breathing. I looked in the rearview mirror a few times before starting the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone walking out of the trees. But there was no one, just the fading light, the empty road, and the sound of gravel under my tires. When I got home, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was dirt smeared on the back of my truck's tailgate. It looked like a handprint, like someone had touched it with muddy fingers. I don't know when that happened. Maybe when I was hiking, maybe while I slept. I scrubbed it off the next morning, but it didn't help much. I never went camping alone again after that. Every time I think about those nights, I remember how silent the woods became when I realized I wasn't the only one out there. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was just someone real, watching, waiting, walking circles around me in the dark. It was late August 2012 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip up in northern Colorado, near the Roosevelt National Forest. I was 29 at the time, living in Fort Collins, working long weeks in a small hardware store. I'd been feeling drained for months, stuck between work and my small apartment, and I just wanted a couple of nights away from noise, traffic, and lights. I borrowed a tent from a coworker and packed up a sleeping bag, a small cooler, a few cans of food, some jerky, and my old hunting knife. My plan was simple: drive up to the mountains, find a quiet spot near a stream, set up camp, and just relax. The drive up was easy. The weather was mild, sky clear, and I reached a small dirt road that led deeper into the forest by noon. There weren't many signs around, and the road looked like it hadn't been used much that summer. I liked that. I parked my car in a small clearing off the road and hiked another half-mile until I found a good spot. The area was quiet except for the sound of water trickling somewhere close by and the occasional rustle of the wind through pine trees. I set up my tent on a small patch of flat ground under a large tree and walked a bit downstream to wash my hands in the cold, clear water. That first day was calm. I collected firewood, set up a small ring of rocks for the fire, and cooked a can of beans and some jerky. The smell of pine and smoke mixed in the air as the light faded, and everything felt peaceful. When night came, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and listened to the forest settling down. The air got colder fast, and I could hear small sounds outside. Maybe small animals moving through the brush, nothing unusual. I fell asleep sometime around 10. I woke up later that night to a noise that didn't fit with the rest. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not one I recognized. It was more like the sound of something heavy brushing against a tree, or maybe the crunch of footsteps on dry pine needles. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe a deer wandering nearby. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had sounded closer than it should have. I stayed awake for a while, staring at the thin wall of the tent, then eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made me uneasy. Near the edge of my camp, about 20 feet from the tent, the ground was disturbed. Not torn up or anything, but there were clear marks in the dirt, like someone had walked around during the night. The steps weren't animal tracks. They looked like boot prints. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to figure out if they could have been mine from the previous day. But they weren't. The tread didn't match my boots, and they circled the area like someone had been walking around the tent, stopping at different spots. It bothered me, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe another hiker passed through and got curious about my setup. I didn't hear anything else that day. I spent most of it hiking up the ridge behind the camp, where the view stretched out over miles of dark green forest. I felt small out there, surrounded by so much quiet. When I got back that evening, the air was still and the sun was dropping behind the trees. I built a small fire, ate, and sat watching the flames flicker. But as the forest got darker, the silence began to feel heavier, almost like the woods were holding their breath. I didn't sleep well that second night. The noises came back. I heard the same soft crunching outside, moving slowly around my tent. I froze, barely breathing. The steps were slow, not panicked, not rushing, like someone walking carefully, trying not to make too much sound. At one point, I thought I heard a quiet thud, like something being set down. Then nothing. I lay there, eyes wide open, for hours until dawn started to creep in through the fabric of the tent. When I finally stepped outside, everything looked normal again. The only difference was that one of the small logs from my fire ring had been moved a few feet away. I knew I should probably pack up and leave, but I didn't. I told myself it was probably just an animal or another camper. I even laughed a bit at how paranoid I was being. I spent the morning fishing in the stream and caught one small trout, which I cooked for lunch. Still, the forest felt different now. Every sound made me glance up. Every gust of wind made me feel watched. That evening, clouds started rolling in, and I could smell rain. I reinforced the tent, gathered extra wood, and tried to make sure everything was dry. When darkness fell, the wind picked up, and rain began tapping on the tent. The fire hissed and died out quickly. I sat inside, listening to the rain, until I heard something over it. Faint, muffled, and wrong. It sounded like a low whistle, drawn out and uneven. Then another. I felt my stomach twist. The rain was loud, but between the gusts, I could hear it again, this time closer, like someone trying to find their way in the dark. I reached for my flashlight and turned it off again almost immediately, afraid of giving away my position. The whistling stopped, replaced by slow movement outside the tent. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it filled the whole space. The sound circled the tent once, then twice. The zipper at the entrance rattled slightly, like someone testing it. I sat completely still, clutching the knife in my hand, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, the sound faded into the rain, moving deeper into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked, and the air was cold. I packed up fast, barely eating anything, and started hiking back to my car. When I reached the dirt road, I saw fresh tire marks. Not mine, not old. They were new, deep in the mud, leading past where I'd parked. My heart sank when I saw the driver's door of my car slightly open. I walked slowly, looking around. The inside was a mess. My cooler was gone, my small knife missing, and even my map had been taken. Someone had gone through everything. I didn't stay to think. I got in, started the engine, and drove until I hit the main road, barely breathing the whole way. I made it back to Fort Collins by evening, parked in front of my apartment, and sat there for a while, just staring at the dashboard. For weeks after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire time out there. Not by some animal, not by anything supernatural, but by a person. Someone who had been close, moving quietly, studying me from the trees, maybe waiting for the right moment. I've never gone camping alone again. Every time I drive into the mountains now, I still think about that third night. The sound of the zipper moving in the dark, the low whistle that carried over the rain, and the footsteps circling the tent while I sat there, pretending not to breathe. I went camping alone in the fall of 2017, somewhere deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. I had taken a week off work and decided I wanted to spend it away from everything. No phone, no traffic, no people. I wanted to be somewhere quiet enough that I could hear the wind moving through the trees. I found a spot near a narrow dirt road that wound up through pine forest, miles from the nearest town. It wasn't an official campsite, just a small clearing beside a stream. There was enough room to park my old silver Tacoma, pitch a tent, and set up a small fire ring from the rocks nearby. The first day went smoothly. I got there around mid-morning, unloaded the truck, and spent a while walking along the stream. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine sap. The water was clear enough to see trout darting between the stones. When I came back, I gathered wood for the fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the flames until the sky went dark. It got cold fast, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang heavy and sharp. The forest went completely still after sunset, except for the occasional rustle of branches when the wind moved through. I remember feeling completely alone, but in a peaceful way. That night, I fell asleep listening to the sound of the stream a few yards away. It was the kind of noise that made it easy to drift off. But at some point, I woke up. It must have been after midnight because the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The forest was pitch black, and the temperature had dropped even more. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard something. It wasn't an animal sound. It was like the noise of dry leaves being stepped on slowly, somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I stayed completely still. I told myself it was probably a deer. The woods were full of them, but the footsteps didn't sound like how a deer moves. They were heavy, slow, careful, like someone trying not to make too much noise. I kept listening. The sound stopped for a while, and I started to think maybe I imagined it. Then it started again, closer this time. The hairs on my arms went up. I reached for the flashlight beside me and clicked it on. The beam hit the inside of the tent, bright and useless. I unzipped the flap slowly and shone the light outside. Nothing. Just the trees, my truck, and the faint mist above the stream. I stayed awake for a long time after that, waiting to hear it again, but the sound never came back. I finally fell asleep sometime before dawn. The next morning, the forest felt different, quiet in a tense kind of way. The air was colder, and the sunlight came through the trees in thin strips. I walked around the clearing just to make sure everything was fine. About 20 feet from the tent, near the tree line, I saw footprints in the soft dirt. They weren't animal prints, they were boots, medium size, fresh, leading from the trees toward the stream, then back again. I followed them a little, but they stopped at the water. The ground there was rocky, so there was no way to see where they went after that. I felt uneasy for the rest of the day. I didn't see or hear anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there during the night. I checked my truck, my gear, everything. Nothing was missing, nothing was moved. I tried to convince myself it was probably a hiker passing through, maybe cutting across the woods. But something about how quiet it was didn't sit right. The woods felt watched. That night, I built the fire bigger and kept it going longer. I wanted the light. The sound of the flames made me feel less exposed. I sat there until almost midnight, staring into the fire, adding wood every time it got low. When I finally crawled into the tent, I kept the flashlight in my hand. I didn't even zip the sleeping bag up all the way because I wanted to be able to move quickly if I had to. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up again. No reason at first, just that sense that something's wrong. I could hear faint movement outside, not far from the tent. I held my breath and listened. It sounded like someone pacing near the truck. Then a soft thud. Then another. It was the sound of the truck door handle being tried. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt. I reached for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. The handle felt cold in my hand. The sound stopped. Everything went still. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. My arm started to cramp from holding the knife so tight. Then, just when I thought it was over, I heard something else. The faint crack of branches being stepped on, moving away into the trees. I waited until the first light of morning before I unzipped the tent. Outside, everything looked the same, but when I checked the truck, I saw muddy smudges on the driver's side door handle. Human handprints. There were more footprints in the dirt near the back of the truck, circling around it, then heading off into the woods. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared again into the undergrowth. Whoever it was had been watching my camp, maybe for hours. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even bother to make breakfast. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing between the trees, just watching. I could feel that I wasn't alone, even if I couldn't see anyone. The moment I started the truck, I felt relief hit me like a wave. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I saw something strange about a mile from my campsite. On the right side of the road, there was an old campsite that looked abandoned. A fire ring full of ashes, an old folding chair, and a blue tarp half buried in leaves. Hanging from one of the branches nearby was a ripped piece of tent fabric, flapping slightly in the wind. It looked like someone had been living there not too long ago. When I finally hit the main highway, I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station near the edge of town. The guy working there told me people sometimes disappear up in those woods.
Hunters, hikers, even campers.
He said there are a lot of old trails up there that lead nowhere, and some folks just go missing. I didn't say much back to him. I filled the tank and got back on the road, heading home. I never went camping alone again after that. Every time I think about that trip, I remember those handprints on the door handle and those footprints circling the truck. Someone was there watching me sleep. And the worst part is, I'll never know what they wanted, or if they're still out there waiting for the next person who parks too far from the road. I went camping alone in the summer of 2013, up in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. I was 27 at the time, and I had taken a week off work just to clear my head. I'd been going through a rough patch. Too many hours in the city, too much noise, too many faces. I wanted to hear wind again, to smell pine sap and dirt, to just exist without checking a clock. I picked a remote area near an old Forest Service road that barely existed anymore. I parked my truck at a clearing that was half swallowed by weeds and started hiking in with my pack, planning to stay for 3 nights. The first day was calm. The hike in took a few hours, mostly uphill through switchbacks and thick brush. I remember the sound of my boots crunching over the dried leaves, and the way the air smelled sharp, like cold water. I found a flat spot near a small creek and decided it was good enough for camp. I pitched my tent under a cluster of firs, got a small fire going, and made some instant noodles. The sky turned orange around 7, and when the sun finally dipped behind the ridges, the forest turned almost silent. Just the distant trickle of water and the occasional crack of a branch. I didn't think much of it then, but sometime around dusk, I heard something that didn't sound like the usual forest noise. It was a short, dry snap, like someone stepping on a stick, coming from uphill behind my tent. I froze for a few seconds, waiting to hear it again, but it stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a falling branch. I tried to shake it off. I stayed up for another hour, staring at the fire until it burned down to a low glow. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag. That first night I slept light. The forest had its own rhythm. Occasional rustles, wind slipping through the trees, but every now and then I thought I heard something more deliberate. Once it sounded like slow footsteps in the leaves, far away but steady. I held my breath, trying to listen, but then it faded. I told myself I was being paranoid. Being alone out there made every small noise feel amplified. I eventually drifted off again. The next morning was clear and quiet. I boiled water for coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided to explore further upstream. I followed the creek for about an hour, moving through patches of mud and moss, until I found what looked like an old hunting camp. There were the remains of a fire pit, some rusted cans, and part of a tarp tangled in a fallen tree. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. The ground was overgrown, but you could still make out where tents might have been set up. I stood there for a while, thinking about who had camped there, what brought them that far out. When I got back to my own camp around noon, I noticed something small that made me pause. One of my backpack straps was unclipped. I was sure I had clipped everything before I left. I told myself maybe I'd just forgotten, maybe I brushed against it earlier. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I walked around the perimeter of my camp, looking for prints or signs of animals, but the ground was covered with pine needles. Hard to tell anything. That afternoon, I went down to the creek again to wash up and fill my bottle. When I came back, I found something even stranger. One of my cooking pots had been moved about 3 feet from where I left it. It was sitting upright, like someone had picked it up and set it down again. I stood there staring at it for a long time, feeling a slow crawl in my chest. I hadn't heard anything. I was sure I was alone. I checked my pack again, checked my tent. Everything else seemed in place. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was a raccoon or something that got curious. Maybe wind. But the pot was heavy and had been moved cleanly, not knocked over. I sat there for hours as daylight faded, not wanting to admit that I felt watched. The forest, once peaceful, now felt like it was holding its breath. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the nylon ceiling of my tent, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not fast, not running, just slow, measured steps moving through the trees behind me. I could hear the weight in them, the crunch of pine needles. They would stop for a few seconds, then start again. I didn't move. My whole body felt locked up. I reached slowly for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. The steps circled wide around my tent, just far enough that I couldn't see anything through the thin fabric. Then silence. I waited maybe 20 minutes before I dared to move again. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the flashlight. I didn't sleep after that. I sat upright in the tent until the sky started turning pale blue. When morning finally came, I got out and checked around the campsite. There were faint impressions in the pine needles, shallow but shaped like boots. Not animal tracks. They led from behind my tent, then off toward the creek. I followed them for maybe 30 feet before they vanished on the hard ground near the rocks. That was enough for me. I packed everything up as fast as I could. My hands were trembling the whole time. As I loaded my backpack, I kept glancing up toward the treeline. I half expected to see someone standing there, watching. Nothing. The forest looked completely normal, calm even. But I could feel it. Something was off. Before leaving, I kicked some dirt over the remains of my fire pit, slung the pack on my shoulders, and started hiking back down toward the truck. The trail felt different going down. Every noise made me turn my head. Every gust of wind sounded like breathing. A few times I stopped, convinced I heard someone moving behind me. But when I turned, it was just empty trees. It took me almost twice as long to get back because I kept stopping to listen. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked, I saw something that made my stomach twist. My truck door on the driver's side was open. Not wide, just a few inches, like someone had checked it. I knew I'd locked it. I dropped my pack and scanned the area, but there was no movement. The woods were quiet. I looked inside. Nothing was taken, nothing was moved, but the glove compartment was open, just hanging open like someone had been looking through it. I didn't even think. I got in, started the engine, and drove until the trees thinned out and the road turned to proper gravel. I didn't stop until I reached cell service and the first gas station 40 miles away. I sat there in the parking lot, hands shaking, just staring at the steering wheel. I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was some drifter, someone living rough in the woods. Maybe it was another camper who didn't want to be seen. But whoever it was had been close enough to touch my things, close enough to walk around my tent while I was inside. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, years later, whenever I drive past thick woods and see a tent tucked deep in the trees, I feel a cold unease in my chest. People think the forest is peaceful because it's quiet. But sometimes the quiet just means you're not supposed to be there. It was early September 2019 when I decided to take a short camping trip alone for the weekend. I was 27, had been working long hours at a warehouse in Wichita, Kansas, and felt like I was suffocating inside that routine of work, eat, sleep, repeat. I wanted silence, a break from traffic, coworkers, lights, and schedules. I wanted to sit somewhere far away and not hear anything human. I picked a spot deep inside the Flint Hills, near a small lake I'd found once when hiking with a friend years earlier. It wasn't a marked campsite, just an open space surrounded by tall grass and thin trees. It took a good hour of dirt road driving to get there. I parked my old Ford Ranger on a patch of gravel and hauled my gear down near the lake. It was quiet enough that I could hear the buzzing of flies and the faint sound of water moving against the shore. The air was hot and dry. The grass crunched under my boots, and there were grasshoppers jumping everywhere. I set up my tent under a lone cottonwood tree, laid out my sleeping bag, and built a small fire ring with rocks. I remember feeling relaxed in a way I hadn't felt in years. I ate some canned chili, drank a beer, and watched the sun fall behind the ridge until the whole valley turned gold and then dark. When it got black out, I could hear every sound: crickets, frogs, the distant hum of something that might have been a generator or maybe just wind in the trees. There was no moon that night, just 1,000 stars above me. I stayed up late just staring at the fire, feeding it small sticks and thinking about nothing. At one point, I heard a splash out on the lake. Probably a fish or a turtle, I told myself, but it came again, sharper, like something heavier hitting the water. Then silence. I glanced toward it but saw only the faint shimmer of water catching the starlight. Eventually I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The ground was hard under my back. The night air smelled dry and dusty. I drifted off sometime around midnight. When I woke, it was still dark, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I didn't know what woke me at first, but then I realized it was a sound. Faint, steady, like the crunch of dry grass. Footsteps, not close, but moving through the brush somewhere behind my tent. I froze. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe even a raccoon. But then it stopped completely. Just silence again. That silence felt heavier than anything. I waited, barely breathing, staring at the faint outline of the tent fabric above me. After what felt like 10 minutes, I heard it again. Slower this time, deliberate. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. It sounded like someone walking carefully, trying not to make noise. I reached for my flashlight but stopped myself before turning it on. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I just listened. The sound came from one side of my tent, then circled halfway around. I could hear the grass brushing against something, and a low creak, like a branch being stepped on. I felt every muscle in my body tense up. I waited for it to pass, to fade away, but it didn't. It stopped again. I could hear nothing. The air inside the tent felt hot and trapped. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that. Eventually, I heard the faint rustle of movement again, only farther away this time. It faded until I couldn't tell if it was gone or if it was just too far for me to hear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I laid there, staring into the dark until the first light started to show through the fabric. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, the air was cold and the world was gray. There were no tracks that I could see, just flattened grass around my camp from where I'd walked the night before. The lake was perfectly still. Everything looked normal, too normal, like nothing had happened. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a coyote or even a stray cow. I tried to shake it off, made some instant coffee, and decided to go for a short hike up the ridge before packing up. As I climbed, the sun came out, bright and warm, burning away the thin mist near the lake. The view from up there was wide and empty. Rolling hills, the small body of water below, and the faint line of dirt road in the distance. No sign of anyone, no movement, but something about the quiet bothered me. It was the kind of silence that felt too still, like it was waiting. When I got back to camp, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My cooler, which I'd left next to the fire ring, was moved. Not tipped over, moved. It was sitting a good 3 feet from where I had left it, the ground beneath it showing a clear drag mark through the dust. I crouched down, looked closer, and saw faint prints around it. Not boots, bare feet, small ones, narrow and long, with visible toes pressed into the dirt. There were maybe 4 or 5 prints, and they led toward the lake and then disappeared into the grass. For a minute, I just stood there staring, not sure what to think. They weren't mine. I'd worn boots the whole time. I checked my truck, my bags, everything. Nothing else was missing or touched. Just that cooler. My first thought was that maybe some kids were camping nearby and messing around. But the nearest town was almost 20 miles away, and there hadn't been any other vehicles on the road when I came in. It didn't make sense. Still, I packed everything up fast. The whole time I kept glancing toward the lake, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Just still water and waving grass. When I started driving back down the dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror more times than I could count. The road twisted through narrow sections of trees and opened again into the flat grassland. At one point, maybe a mile from camp, I passed a patch of soft dirt and noticed something along the side. A single barefoot print pressed into the road. It was fresh, still sharp around the edges. I didn't stop. I just kept driving until I hit the paved road again. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while because it sounded too strange. But a few weeks later, I read something online about people finding small, isolated camps in that same area. Makeshift shelters built from branches and plastic, old food cans, signs that someone had been living out there. Probably some drifter or recluse who didn't want to be found. I started thinking about that night again, the footsteps circling my tent, the way they stopped and listened, the way my cooler had been moved like someone was testing how close they could get. Even now, years later, I still camp sometimes, but never alone. Every time I hear the sound of grass moving at night, I feel that same tightness in my chest. I always think about those bare footprints by the lake, the quiet way whoever it was moved, and how easily they got that close to me without ever making a sound loud enough to wake me until they were right there. I never went back to that spot again. I don't even like driving near it. When I think about that trip, I don't remember the stars or the fire or the peace I was looking for. I only remember that slow crunch of footsteps in the dark, and the feeling that someone, somewhere out in those hills, was still watching from the grass. It was the summer of 2011 when I decided to go camping alone in the northern part of Idaho, not far from the Canadian border. I was 26 back then, working a dead-end warehouse job, tired of everything and everyone. I needed to be away from people, away from screens and noise. I wanted to hear nothing but trees moving in the wind and the sound of water hitting the rocks in a stream. I had gone camping with friends plenty of times, but never by myself. I thought I'd be fine. I packed too much food, a tent that was heavier than it needed to be, a sleeping bag, and an old hunting knife I had bought at a garage sale years ago, but never actually used for anything serious. The drive up there took nearly 8 hours. I left early in the morning, stopping only once for gas and coffee. The farther north I went, the less I saw of people. Small towns turned into scattered houses, then just empty stretches of highway surrounded by forest. I followed a dirt road that my map app said would lead to a remote camping area near a lake called Clearwater Ridge. The road looked unused, grass growing up through the middle, and I didn't see another car once I turned onto it. I reached the lake in the afternoon. It was quiet, too quiet. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the line of pine trees on the opposite bank. I parked my car close to a clearing and set up my tent about 30 feet from the water. I could see where other campers might have been before. Flattened patches of grass, an old fire ring made from blackened rocks, but there was no sign of anyone being there recently. After setting up camp, I spent an hour walking around, just exploring. There was a trail that led into the woods behind the lake, narrow and winding, full of broken branches and thick roots sticking up from the dirt. I followed it for maybe half a mile before turning back. The air felt heavy, still, and I didn't hear any birds or bugs like I normally would in the woods. I tried not to think much of it. I told myself it was just that kind of quiet forest, maybe because of the time of day. When I got back, I made a small fire and cooked some canned chili. The sun was starting to set, painting the lake orange and gold. I sat by the fire for a long time, watching the surface of the water turn darker and darker until it was just a flat black mirror. I should have gone to bed then, but I didn't feel tired. I just sat there, staring at the tree line on the far side of the lake, the kind of staring where your eyes adjust and you start to think you're seeing shapes moving even when you're not. It was around 10 p.m. when I finally crawled into the tent. I zipped it up, got into my sleeping bag, and lay there listening to the occasional crack of a branch outside. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. Probably animals. But the thing was, it didn't sound like small animals. It was heavier, more spaced out, like footsteps, but not rhythmic, just slow, uneven movements through the brush. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things because I was alone. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was pitch black. My first thought was that something had woken me, but I couldn't figure out what. Then I heard it again. Something moving outside the tent. Not close, not brushing up against it or anything, but circling. I could hear the faint crunch of dirt and pine needles under weight. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but I didn't. I just listened. The movement would stop for a few seconds, then start again like whoever or whatever it was kept pausing to listen to. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that. My body was tense, my jaw tight, and I could feel the heat of my own breath trapped inside the sleeping bag. When I finally worked up the nerve, I slowly unzipped it and reached for my knife. I didn't plan to go outside. I just needed to feel like I had something if I had to defend myself. After a few minutes, the noise stopped completely. I didn't hear anything else the rest of the night. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, blinking against the sunlight. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was again. No birds, no insects, just still air and the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. I walked a few steps toward the trees and noticed prints in the dirt, fresh ones. They were spaced too far apart for a normal stride. They weren't boot prints either. I couldn't make out exactly what they were, but they looked like someone had walked barefoot, dragging their feet slightly in the dirt. The tracks circled my tent twice before heading back into the woods. I felt that sick feeling in my stomach, the kind that makes your whole body go cold. I didn't want to believe it was a person, but it had to be. There weren't any big animals around here that moved like that. Whoever it was had been walking around my tent in the middle of the night, just watching. I decided I'd pack up and leave. The plan was to be there 3 days, but I didn't care anymore. As I was tearing down the tent, I realized something else. The food container I'd left locked inside my car was open. The passenger door was slightly cracked. I hadn't noticed it earlier because I was too focused on the tracks. I checked inside. My cooler was open, some of the food missing, but the strangest part was that the driver's seat was pushed all the way back like someone had been sitting in it. I knew for a fact I hadn't left it that way. That's when the fear really hit. Whoever had been outside the tent last night had come up to my car too. I didn't wait to find out if they were still nearby. I threw everything into the back seat, not even bothering to organize it, and got in. The dirt road felt longer than before. Every turn, every shadow between the trees made me think I'd see someone standing there watching. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped for gas in a small town about an hour south. While I was filling up, I noticed something on the back window, a long, greasy handprint smudged into the glass. It looked like someone had pressed their hand flat against it, dragging it slightly down the side. The mark was faint but fresh, like it had been made just that morning. I never went back to that area again. I still think about those footprints circling my tent and how quiet that forest was. Like even the animals knew something was wrong there. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had opened the tent that night, or if I had stayed just one more day. Every time I remember it, I realize how lucky I was that whatever was out there only watched, and didn't decide to come inside. I went camping alone in late September of 2013, somewhere deep in the northern part of Montana. I had been wanting to do a solo trip for years, and after saving up enough money and getting some time off work, I finally decided to just go for it. I packed my old green tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food for 3 days, and drove up north from Helena until the paved road turned into gravel and then into a narrow dirt path that twisted through thick pine forest. The last bit of the drive felt endless, the kind of road where the trees lean in close and block most of the light. I parked beside a small clearing where the dirt widened just enough to fit my car and decided to hike a few miles in to make sure I wouldn't see or hear anyone else. By the time I found a flat area beside a shallow creek, the sun was already low and everything had that golden, fading light. I set up my tent under a large pine and cleared away sticks and stones from the ground before unrolling my sleeping bag. I could hear the creek gurgling quietly a few feet away, and somewhere far off a single bird kept calling. It felt isolated but peaceful. I cooked a small meal on the stove, cleaned up carefully so nothing smelled too strong, and sat on a log to eat. The air was cold but still. I remember thinking how nice it was not to hear traffic or people, just the sounds of nature fading into the night. When it got dark, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and turned off my lantern. The quiet was so deep that it almost hummed in my ears. I could hear every tiny noise outside, the creak of a tree in the wind, the trickle of water, a twig snapping somewhere far away. I tried to convince myself it was just animals. Still, it took me a long time to fall asleep. At some point during the night, I woke up suddenly without knowing why. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that feels wrong, like something is holding its breath. My watch said 2:37 a.m. I lay still, listening. Then I heard what sounded like soft footsteps, very slow and deliberate, moving just beyond my tent. I froze. It wasn't the sound of a deer or raccoon. Those usually make quick, random movements. This was steady, human-paced. Crunch, pause, crunch, another pause. It circled halfway around the tent and stopped. I held my breath, my heart thudding so loud I was sure whoever, or whatever it was, could hear it. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, expecting to see a shadow or movement. But nothing happened. The footsteps never came closer. I thought maybe I imagined it. Eventually, I forced myself to stay still until my muscles ached, and I must have drifted off again from exhaustion. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked outside. The forest looked calm and empty. I stepped out, the ground still damp from the night, and walked around the tent. That's when I saw them, clear footprints in the dirt and pine needles. Not animal tracks, human. They circled my tent once, then led back toward the woods, heading uphill toward the tree line. They weren't mine. I could see the difference in size and shape. Whoever it was had been right outside, walking around while I slept. I tried to brush it off as maybe a lost hiker or someone passing through, though it didn't make sense for anyone to be that far out there in the middle of the night. Still, I didn't want to overthink it. I made coffee, packed a small day bag, and decided to go on a short hike along the creek. The forest was dense, with tall trees and thick ferns. I followed the creek for about an hour before I found what looked like an old fire pit made of stones. There were some half-burned pieces of wood and a rusted tin can. It looked old, but not ancient. I got an uneasy feeling like someone had used it recently. When I got back to camp, something felt different. My tent door was half open. I always zipped it closed completely. I stood still for a long time, listening. Nothing. I checked inside. My sleeping bag was slightly moved, and the small bag of trail mix I'd left in the corner was gone. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I tried to tell myself maybe a small animal got in, though I couldn't see any tear marks or tracks inside. That night, I kept the lantern on inside the tent and stayed awake for a long time, listening to every sound. Around midnight, I heard something again. A single crunch of leaves, then another, closer this time. I sat up quietly and grabbed the small hatchet I kept by my side. The light flickered faintly against the fabric. The sound stopped. Then, just barely, I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing from right outside the tent. I could hear it through the thin fabric. I didn't move. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, but then it stopped. I waited, shaking so hard I could barely hold the hatchet. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally came, I decided I was done. I packed everything as fast as I could, stuffed the tent into the car, and drove out. As I reached the dirt road that led back to the highway, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something in the trees. A figure standing far back, just at the edge of the woods. I couldn't make out a face, just the shape of a person. When I got home later that day, I noticed the trail mix bag stuffed into my backpack pocket. But I hadn't put it there. It was folded neatly, almost like someone had placed it carefully. For weeks after, I kept thinking about those footprints, the breathing, and that moment I saw someone standing in the trees. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe another camper, maybe a local wandering around. But the area I'd camped in wasn't anywhere near a trail or known site. It was deep backcountry. Nobody should have been there. I never reported it because I didn't even know what to say. Someone watched me sleep in the woods? Sounds crazy, but I haven't gone camping alone since. I still have the tent rolled up in my garage. Dirt from that trip still stuck to the bottom. Every time I see it, I think about those slow footsteps circling me in the dark, and that breath right outside my tent. How close it was. The more I replay it, the more I realize how quiet that person was. How patient. They didn't try to hurt me, didn't steal anything important. They just watched. That's what unsettles me the most. Someone out there spent the night moving around silently, standing a few feet away, waiting for something. I still wonder what they wanted, or how long they were there before I ever woke up that first night.